everybody, and welcome back to the T.H.O. Movie Reviews podcast, the show where we bring you passionate, honest, and insightful film criticism. I'm your host, Lora Herman, and we are here today to discuss our top 5 sequels list. I'm joined by some of my colleagues, starting with Patrick Belin. Patrick, please tell me, was this like a difficult process, like narrowing it down to 5 sequels, or was it difficult just to find 5?
It wasn't all that difficult to find 5 sequels that I really enjoyed. I think what I had the most trouble with is actually ranking them, and because when you rank them, you start thinking about their qualities, what makes them good, what makes them bad, and that's what I want to get into later in this podcast. So I have 5. I brought 5 films here. I ranked them 1 to 5 just because that's what we agreed on initially, but to me, they're more of a collection of 5 films, whereas my number 5 is not necessarily better or worse than my number 1. They're just, the more I thought about the 5 films that I picked, they all bring something unique to the table. So we'll get into that a little bit more later. So,
well, I'm excited to hear more. And Ben, I just need to know, how does it feel to be outside of the role as host today? Sentiments.
It feels so damn good. It's like it's like like being a father, and you're like worrying about getting the kids off to school and packing their lunches and organizing things and what have you. And today it's like I get to be a child again, and I get to have somebody else pack my lunch and make sure I get off to school on time. It's really. It's nice. It's awesome. Yeah. It's been a long couple of years, but a beautiful and rewarding couple of years as well.
Well, I'm glad to relieve that burden for you today, as beautiful as the burden might be. So today we'll be covering our picks for the top 5 movie sequels, like I said, and we'll just be starting with the one that maybe barely made the cut and ending with our number 1 pick. So, Patrick, we're going to start off with you. We want to hear about 5 and 4.
5 and 4. Oh, I thought we were going to start with 5. So, number 5, The Two Towers, Lord of the Rings from 2002, and my number 4 is The Dark Knight from 2008. Okay, let's see, what can I say about these two? What's funny about the Dark Knight, of course, it's from the Batman franchise, and as opposed to The Two Towers, it's not really an established film franchise, so there are differences between those two. Why I picked them as 5 and 4, I can't really say too much. Like I said earlier, my ranking is a bit loose in that regard.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I'm really interested in your selection of The Two Towers, because people generally gravitate toward The Return of the King. I like The Two Towers better myself, but it is like it's not the typical pick, So I'm curious about what drew you toward The Two Towers over The Return of the King.
Well, also when I think about sequels, I tend to think of the second follow-up as opposed to the third or fourth in the series. So that's how I'm defining sequel here. And as far as these films that come in 3 parts, like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, I tend to think of the middle film as the one that make or break the series. So.
I think it's a very good point. Yeah.
Of course, The Return of the King finished off the story, and it was a very, very good film, very satisfying film, etc., etc. You can praise it all you want; it deserves all the praise. But I think The Two Towers really showed how the characters grew, and really, it built on the momentum of the first film, and it set up the reward of the third film. Like the greatness of the first and the third Lord of the Rings would not have been possible if they screwed up the middle one. In my opinion, they really had to set up. They really had to make these characters grow, and show a lot of their conflict and everything. And this is why I pick. I would have to go with Two Towers as opposed to Fellowship. Well, also because of what I just said earlier, I tend to, I'm looking at the follow-ups as opposed to third or fourth in the series.
Sure.
Yeah, interestingly enough, went around discussing with lots of friends and colleagues, just like, man, I'm not really sure about some of my sequel picks, any suggestions, and people just kept saying Two Towers. I can't even tell you how many times, I heard that from people. And the funniest thing is, since when Ben and I talked about this, we talked about sequels in the nature of, just something else in a series that was started by one, and there's more from it within the same world, right? Mm-hmm. And I just said, I couldn't honestly pick Two Towers as my pick, because I really so much prefer Fellowship of the Ring, to Two Towers, and I don't know if I could talk about it as being as important to me as the first one. So I'm actually really glad that you picked it, because as a crowd consensus, it really is the one to carry in. And, if you don't have much more to say about that, do you have any comments on The Dark Knight? I'm interested to hear, since it's one of my picks too.
The Dark Knight is a terrible movie. It's a hack job. Yeah. And you know what the worst part of it was? Heath Ledger. God damn it, that guy was an awful actor.
Oh, Ben.
No, I'm sorry. That's not even funny, is it?
That's sacrilege. Don't say things like that in this house.
Before I answer that question, I think it goes without saying that I think even though we're focused on this idea of sequels, right? I think it goes without saying that the usual things still apply. There has to be good writing, good directing, good acting, blah blah blah. All those things in any standalone film have to apply.
And a great sequel does have to stand alone. It's you have to have pre-knowledge maybe, but it's still got to be a self-contained.
Yes, of course.
You essentially have to be able to bring your grandma, who never saw the first one, if she just kind of wanted to come, and she could still get what's going on.
The old grandma test.
Yeah, right. It's a classic. But of course, sequels carry with them the expectation aspect of it, as opposed to like a single film or standalone film, right? So that's what makes them unique. So again, going back to The Dark Knight, I think it's just like the Two Towers. It really built upon the first film. Whereas the first Batman was the making of Batman. Bruce Wayne becoming Batman, and the second film was really brought out what Batman is all about as a character, internal conflicts, and it did that very well. The reason why I would rank Dark Knight above Two Towers is because I think The Dark Knight was a strong complement to the first film, whereas the Two Towers was an established second part of a 3-part series, whereas it had that aspect to it, and going back to Dark Knight, because it's a follow-up to the first film, and there was never it was never established that there was going to be a third film after that. So when they constructed The Dark Knight, they made it so that it could have ended there, and it didn't need anything after that. And I think with that, it made it just a much stronger film than The Two Towers, in my opinion, just slightly stronger. And that's why I would rank it above, in that fourth spot anyways.
That's one thing I was thinking about as well, like the Two Towers, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, it's just kind of, part and parcel of the stories Peter Jackson was telling. Two Towers is almost like an installment in like a Lord of the Rings TV show, in a way. Whereas like The Dark Knight, I know my grandma does not want to see it, but she would understand it. Like, she would walk in and get the idea, Batman exists, it's Gotham. You don't even have to know anything about Ra's al Ghul or Bruce Wayne's parents. It's the story of Batman versus the Joker. There's a cleanness to that.
As far as qualities of both of them, they're both adapted from established stories, and they were both done very well, and that's why they made 2 spots on my top 5.
I personally also am a huge fan of a well done adaptation, so I think that's really a great thing to point out. And if that's all you have to say about your picks, maybe we should move along. Ben, what are your last 2 of your top 5.
My last two, my worst favorites
Worst favorites.
of the top 5. Okay, one of them is going to be super controversial. One of them is going to be so uncontroversial that it's almost too easy. 5 for me is Spider-Man 3.
Really?
Yes, really. Yeah, I love Spider-Man 3 that much.
Oh, we're talking about the Tobey Maguire Spider-Mans.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The real Spider-Man.
Yeah,
There's so many
you.
reboots. It's kind of confusing.
Yeah.
Like, what?
I know. Yeah. No, it's like I mean, there's 6. There's 6 now.
Or
There's
you could
3
just
different
say-
Spider-Men. You know.
could say Spider-Man with the black costume Spider-Man.
The Black Goo Spider-Man.
Yeah,
the
Black
Black
Goo
Goo Spider-Man
Spider-Man.
where he dances. This is
Yes.
a musical Spider-Man movie of sorts.
Oh, God.
Yes. So Spider-Man 3. You know, I think one thing people often mistake about Spider-Man is they'll say, you know, oh, the funny thing about Peter Parker is he's a loser. Well, he's not actually a loser. He's actually a very decent, honorable guy who, you know, it's important to him to be compassionate to people, to, you know, to live his life with dignity. But the problem is, you know, I think like anybody who lives like that, like anybody who tries to, you know, treat people fairly, you know, the thought lurks in the back of their mind. What if I stopped doing that? What if I stopped, you know, holding myself to that standard? Spider-Man 3 is about what happens when you do that. It's about how little by little he falls short of his own standards, you know, first by simply being a little too cocky and enjoying the celebrity power of being Spider-Man too much, then by slowly getting worse and worse until we get into the movie's, you know, metaphor for drug addiction via the black costume, and then getting to the point where, you know, he actually becomes a practicer of domestic violence, which is, you know, one of, to this date, I think one of the most horrifying things that's ever been shown in that kind of film. And but the really extraordinary thing is, you know, Spider-Man 3 is not like Revenge of the Sith, which came out 2 years before. You know, this is a movie, you know, where we get to see a character's rise, fall, and redemption, and I think it's really amazing in the third act, you know, where he finally realizes I've gone too far, you know, I've lost myself, I don't know who I am anymore. And then that moment, you know, at the end where, you know, he takes the old red and blue costume out from his bed, you know, much like he did when he was a kid first starting out as Spider-Man, and, you know, realizes, hey, it's time to come back, it's time to learn how to be a good man again. And I think it's a really powerful journey. Number 4, the uncontroversial one, is The Empire Strikes Back.
And I see you dressed up for that today.
Well, technically I dressed up for one that's coming out later, but we'll get to that. We're getting into, you know, the
meaning of the Star Wars.
when we're getting into Luke Skywalker couture, you know. I mean, but the thing about The Empire Strikes Back is, I feel that you know, Star Wars started out as, you know, a story of good versus evil, but for me, like, that's not what it is ultimately. Star Wars is about, you know, showing how we grow up, and as we grow up, we realize that the world gets a lot more complex, and, you know, The Empire Strikes Back is the movie where that happens. You know, I've been thinking a lot about why is it we often like the second movie in a trilogy the best, and what I've concluded is, you know, the middle part is when, you know, the heroes are challenged and things are unresolved, and I think, you know, life is kind of like that. You know, we all like, you know, Ewok dance parties and stuff, but, you know, we're all living more in The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. You know, we usually, you know, when we go to bed at night, you know, there are loose ends. There are things like, oh, I got to do this tomorrow. There's this, you know, what horrible new thing has Trump done that I'm going to find out when I wake up in the morning, you know? And so, like, The Empire Strikes Back, you know, fits into that whole paradigm in really a great primal way. It's about the characters suffering, you know, it's about Han and Leia being on the run from the Empire, about Han ultimately, you know, sacrificing himself for her. It's about Luke, you know, undergoing extraordinarily severe trials, not only the training with Yoda, which is harrowing when you think about it, but, you know, confronting his father, learning who his father is, and yet at the end you get that beautiful scene with Luke and Leia, you know, on the Rebel cruiser, beyond the galaxy, staring out at this, this array of planets and stars that they're fighting over to defend. And, they haven't won yet. They've suffered all these setbacks, but they're going to keep going. And I like to think that, when Luke is just calmly staring out at the galaxy, he's thinking, bring it on. I don't know if, we're going to beat the Empire or if, Vader really is my father, but, I've got a new hand.
Yeah.
I'm getting out of bed. I'm ready for whatever comes next. And I think, in spite of being a really dark movie with a really macabre sense of humor, I mean, it actually becomes a running joke, Darth Vader choking people to death. I think it's a really, in a way, kind of a beautiful and sweet story.
And what strikes me out of all of that insight, it is really the interesting correlation here that I'm just now noticing. Maybe I'm just crazy, guys, between The Empire Strikes Back and Two Towers, in that the sort of four main characters are split into pairs of two.
Yes.
I've never thought about it before. Kind of Yoda and Luke off on their own, Han and Leia off on their own, and then you have Sam and Frodo on their own, and then Merry and Pippin kind of do their own thing a little bit. And I don't know if you guys have anything to say about that.
Yes, I have a lot to say about it. I have a lot to say about everything movie related, but that's, that's how it goes. I mean, that's a pivotal part of the hero's journey, at least in pop culture, which is that, for the hero to truly grow, to be truly tested, they've got to be separated from, what they know, from what makes them comfortable. Luke and Han have to be separated for them both to fulfill their destinies. Same thing with the Two Towers. Same thing with X2, which I'm going to talk about later. All the characters in that movie are split off into different branches, and I just think, I mean, it's just, again, a good sequel, draws on things that are true, and what's true is, in life there are moments where you have to go it alone to grow. I had to, move to another city, and go to a different college than was in my hometown in order to grow, so I respond to that kind of thing.
I'm glad you were able to put the words to the small observation that I was making there. It's just,
I don't think it's a small observation. I think it's a big observation.
Thank you.
This is part of what makes a lot of these movies we're talking about great.
Yeah, it's exactly what I need you to say, Ben. And thanks for coming in clutch there. And if anybody else doesn't have anything else to say, I'll just go ahead and swoop on in.
Yeah, well, Empire is also on my list, so perhaps I'll save my comments on that until we get to...
Until you bring it up later.
Save your Empireisms. Yeah. I'm sure there'll be many. Well, I'll probably say more about Empire when you bring up Empire. So.
Then maybe I'll say some more.
Yeah.
We'll just make it an Empire Strikes Back podcast. Well, with no further ado, I'm just here to ruin everyone's day and say that my number 5 pick is The Phantom Menace. I understand people have some problems, and I do too, but I just have to say that for one reason or another, maybe it's my age, or I don't know, maybe it's just the fact that when I saw, the original trilogy, it was all on a really small, black square TV, and then,
Me too.
And getting to see, later the prequels in theaters, I think I just have this weird connection to the prequels in general, and I almost went for the Attack of the Clones. But the reason I picked The Phantom Menace relies almost solely on Darth Maul, and this weird obsession that my friends and I have with Darth Maul and Darth Maul's theme.
I had that obsession as a child myself.
So you know what I'm
I wanted to do backflips because of Darth Maul.
Darth Maul, and then it just, for whatever one reason or another, the just really gets to me, and you're like, yeah, Darth Maul. Wait a second, he does kill some people. We're a bit upset about that. But anyways, Phantom Menace is a very odd film. I feel like the sort of I can never say, please don't fault me for not being able to pronounce all of these sort of Star Wars technical terms. But the Gungan, is that what it is?
The Gungans?
Gungans?
Yeah.
The Gungan
Oh, George Lucas, though, would, once they caught him on tape, accidentally calling them the Goongans.
Goongans.
George Lucas couldn't even remember the name.
So if George Lucas can't do it, maybe I can't even. But the Gungans just seem so sort of fantastical beyond the Star Wars limit to me, but it's hilarious and comfortable somehow still when I revisit The Phantom Menace, all the time. Like, 'cause I know them, and they seem right now, but when I really put my mind to it, I'm just like, this seems really random and convenient, but, stepping aside from those sort of moments of hilarity and, slideshow transitions that we all know and love, I think,
the star wipes.
The star wipes, yes. When you get to see, Anakin in his youth, at home with his mother, and sort of the circumstances of his youth, and that, good old argument of the upbringing of a psychopath sort of thing, is really interesting, and it's nice to have that sort of background, and to me it just feels so natural, because I think, I just learned about and discovered all of the Star Wars, pre the Force Awakens, kind of on the same timeline, that it's hard, I didn't visit the prequels as someone who had, seen the first trilogy and then been long awaiting them. It was probably within the same couple of years that I saw all 6 of those movies, and so now, some 10 years later from when I first saw them, it's hard to discern, what's original and what's canon for me, because they just are, and I just really get some good old comforting entertainment from The Phantom Menace, and I think I am a slave to my age and generation of the instant gratification and, the quick cuts and how fast the story moves along. It's just The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones I tend to revisit a lot more, even though I clearly prefer The Empire Strikes Back in general. I just knew it was already going to be on your list, so I thought I would just be a little bit of a troublemaker.
Well, can I just clarify?
Yeah, interject, please.
Would you say you would you call yourself a Star Wars fan when you were exposed to Phantom Menace, or did you become a Star Wars fan after the Phantom Menace?
I think I was a Star Wars fan from when I first started watching it, and that would be the original trilogy. Like I said,
okay.
I just remember really distinctly, I think I was like 6, just based on the house that I was living in. I've moved quite a few times in my lifetime, and my mom has always owned the original trilogy as like a set of 3 VHS tapes. And for whatever reason, this random week, it was just so bizarre that I can't remember if she brought it up or if I asked about it, but she was like, you gotta watch these, and I watched them alone in my room. I think 3 nights in a row I watched all of them, and I was just really engrossed, and I don't really remember why. I just remember that I was, and then eventually I think I visited for the first time the prequels with my cousins who lived in Arizona, so probably the next time I went to see them, that summer, Christmas, probably was when I started to see the prequels. I don't remember that as distinctly, but, just as far as since then, I've revisited The Phantom Menace the most, I think.
Can I ask you a question as well?
Please do.
So, I mean, I guess, so what I'm curious about is, I kind of had a similar experience to you growing up. I actually became a Star Wars fan I guess the Christmas before Attack of the Clones came out, and so I had no problem with the Phantom Menace or the Attack of the Clones, growing up, but I did become kind of disillusioned later, because feeling well, I just those characters for me don't have the charm of Han or Luke or Leia, thinking I still think I still love the pod race, I still love that final duel with Darth Maul, that duel is just insane, but then it's other things come up, it's oh man, it's hard to enjoy the movie anymore because I hate Jar Jar Binks so much now, so I guess I'm just curious, do you feel like there are flaws but you enjoy in spite of that, or do you disagree? Do you feel like what the things people say are flaws aren't flaws at all? Because I know I just argued on behalf of Spider-Man 3, so I have sequels that I feel that way about.
I don't think flaws is necessarily just the word that I'd use. I'd say where charm is the word that you might use for moments that are amusing or lighthearted in the original trilogy. Charm of Han and Leia and maybe even Luke, even though kind of maybe charm isn't the word so much. But
I was going to the Toshi station to pick up some power converters!
Exactly. But I think the different word is sort of quirky or comic. You're not looking for... I think it's not trying to be charming in the first three, or maybe it is, and it's just horribly failed, and it's so horribly failed.
The first three, you mean the prequels?
The first three, yeah, it's such a hard thing to, first three prequels. There could have been going forth, replicating that initial charm, sincere charm. I feel like that, emulates from the original trilogy.
Yeah.
But, if they horribly failed, they at least succeeded in making it just seem, sort of like quirky and comical, and I had a really great word I was going to say earlier, I forgot it, but I guess I just don't look at it as a comparison so much, and when I do, I still even compare them as being like things that are different, but they're from like a similar seed, so maybe it's just a different mindset or perspective, but yeah, I don't think it's flawed. I don't think it's similar or at the same sort of level as the original trilogy. I kind of just enjoy it for what it is,
I want to hear about your next pick in a sec, but I have to ask.
Okay.
But we can. No worries. We'll cut that part out. Okay. So I do have to ask. How do you feel about Jar Jar? Like, can you do you?
I just think, like I said, it just happened at some sort of formative age for me that I don't really have a lot of problem with him.
Okay.
Because it's kind of like, this is such a dramatic and, cliche thing to say, but it's like, how do you feel about the sky? Well, I'm just like, I don't know, it just is, it just, I couldn't picture the movies without him, and he is annoying, but maybe I feel like it serves a purpose, since I feel like without Jar Jar there'd probably be no depth. It's like heroism versus not heroism. It's like good and evil, like you said, which Star Wars isn't really about, and I feel like adding in this sort of character, for better or worse, that's just really for laughs, just to be made fun of, kind of gives you the separation that even within this like group, they're maybe not so shiny and raising their swords. They're kind of more of like a ragtag team, even one of the main protagonists you don't realize is a main protagonist until later because she has a stunt double. You only see her as a bystander, a potential love interest, and then, you see at the end, really she had a lot more stake than you knew. And so things like that, I think, add a bit of depth and sort of like patchworkness to their, heroic dynamic that I appreciate. It's a bit more ragtag.
Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I like that you bring up the fact that you saw this movie as a kid, because I think what gets lost in all this Star Wars banter is the fact that people are forgetting that a lot of these movies are made for kids.
Yeah.
And on that level, I think it makes a lot of sense to have Jar Jar Binks in the movie. And well, personally, I have no problem with him. I have no problem with the Ewoks, Jar Jar Binks, the Gungans, the Porgs, all that stuff. I think that's appropriate for a film that's directed at kids. But in terms of Phantom Menace or even all the prequel trilogies, I think they're panned a lot more than they deserve to be. I don't think they're as bad as they really are.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're, especially, with episodes 1 and 2, I think there are some serious issues with what I would call watchability, and in terms of the craft of filmmaking. The third one being the most watchable out of the three, in my opinion. But I think a lot of that has to do with just because George Lucas has been out of the game for a long time, in terms of being a director and things like that. He's not preparing his actors very well. He's not positioning the camera the best way. He was the main screenwriter, the main scriptwriter, so he's juggling all these hats, and he didn't do it brilliantly, in my opinion. And I think you can criticize the films for that, but as a whole trilogy, the prequel trilogies, I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. And if you see it in the lens of these are children's films, not necessarily children's films, but they're directed towards young people. They're they're trying to be welcoming towards young people, and I think they're fine. They're really entertaining, and in defense of George Lucas, I think he really put a lot of heart into it and a lot of creativity, and it's quirky. They're quirky films.
Yeah, I completely agree.
One thing I do want to point out is I feel that I agree with the they're for children idea in one sense and not in another, because it's like we all I think have a great experience with Star Wars as children that's very pure, in terms of buying the toys and I played with Star Wars Legos. I love doing that, But I one thing I feel like is like George Lucas would use it as a cop out. When everyone criticized him, he would say, well, they're for kids. You don't understand because you're not a kid. And I sort of felt like it's it's well, all of us we're gonna have to live with the Star Wars films as we grow old.
Can they withstand the test of time and aging and life?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of, and I feel like it's well, I mean, I find the ones I love, they still help me in my life. They still have this resonance, and I think it's, I think it's okay if we hold them up to adult standards, and I think it's okay if we nitpick at Hayden Christensen's acting, or the fact that Padme doesn't seem to have a problem with Anakin killing an entire tribe of Tusken Raiders, including the women and the children. She says, "Annie, to be angry is to be human." It's what would you say that if they were people? There's some things that he should have cracked in the writing room, but at the same time, I mean you bring up we were talking about Jar Jar, and I can't stand Jar Jar personally. He's nails on a chalkboard to me. But I read this great book called Star Wars Conquered the Universe recently, and they talked to a guy who's one of the biggest prequel defenders, and he makes a great point. He talks about how yes, he is annoying, but that's true to life, and you have to put up with people like that and show them compassion, and so I think you both offered really compelling defenses for the prequels, and I think there's something to that.
Well, Ben, I have to say that you did provide the perfect transition to my fourth pick.
Oh, good.
And just speaking of movies directed towards children that somehow do reach to adults, year after year, my fourth pick is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Arguably the best Harry Potter movie out there.
This is number 4.
This is number 3.
3.
Oh, my fourth pick, but number 3 in the Harry Potter trilogy or
Harry
series.
Potter series.
It's 3.
It's 3. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
For those of us listening that might not be so familiar, it's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Chamber of Secrets, Prisoner of Azkaban, so on and so forth. So, Prisoner of Azkaban, directed by Alfonso Cuarón. Alfonso Cuarón also, if I'm not mistaken, director of Gravity. Yes, that's what I thought.
Children of Men.
And is, as I was reminded this morning by checking out Nerdwriter's video essay on, understanding art as a case study of Prisoner of Azkaban, that Alfonso Cuarón is really just a master of the moving camera and the cinematography and the dynamicism? There we go. I'm trying to go with an ism of dynamic.
I like that. I don't know if it's a word, but it sounds right.
Sounds
it feels
right
good.
Of his shots. It's really engaging, and Nerdwriter makes it so clear to me, why the third Harry Potter is the one that I've watched the most, and I've even discussed with a friend of mine who's a Harry Potter fanatic that it's the one she's seen the most, and it is the point for Harry Potter, the character, that he is kind of entering more into this darkness of the series. The Dementors literally sucking the happiness and the soul out of you, to this criminal on the loose that's potentially out to get him. It kind of makes this transition. And again, I'm very much so paraphrasing Nerdwriter here, that transition from the lightheartedness of the first 2 films to the kind of more darkness of the series that we're going to see more and more as it progresses. Even just like I said, with its cinematography and its staging, the lighting, having really dramatic shifts to darkness when the Dementors are present. I think it's a really great way to visually represent, the ensuing danger that Harry will be facing, as someone who is really quite young. And I think it is this sort of dynamic that makes this movie so appealing. You still have these characters that you've been set up to love and, feel joy as a result of seeing them interact, Harry and Hermione and Ron, and sort of their whole, gang, the wizard gang, that, you're familiar with from the first two, but now it's on this whole different landscape, and I think that, in every decision made in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, that Alfonso Cuarón just made that point so clear, that I really appreciate it. I think all 8 films are fantastic, and I own all of them, and I've seen them all a million times, and I am particularly just a huge fan of the epic battle scenes in both of the Deathly Hallows, but, the third one is this really nice sort of inner point, before Voldemort returns, but after, it's sort of kind of past the point of childlike, games. It's kind of a really interesting sort of, turning point.
Yeah, the series got really dark.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it stayed that way after Azkaban.
Cool.
Yeah.
I love that too. What strikes me the most is the change. Is Chris Columbus directed the first 2 films. I felt like I wasn't a big fan of the visual style of the first 2 films because I felt it could look a little bright and tacky at times. Like, whereas all this, you get Cuarón in there, all of a sudden, everything is very, shadowy and elegant and, romantic and rich and sweeping. Yeah. I mean, do you think that, that in a way, like, even though Columbus set the table with the casting and some of the production design, that Cuarón is the reason why we were able to get, movies like Goblet of Fire, Order of the Phoenix, or Deathly Hallows?
I'd say largely yes. I think it's kind of maybe a triad of J.K. Rowling just having the books be that way, to start out. That, I am a reader. I was a truthful Harry Potter fan. I read all of the books, before seeing the movies. I've read the books 5 or so times each. And I think that's just really what happens in the books. It's, she sets up for that Harry, is very important in this world, or the world, the wizarding world, and there's a lot to be done later on, and I think she creates all these characters that are all going to be so important throughout, down to the smallest character, like something like Crutcher, who is so important, a creature, Crutcher, I call him Crutcher, later on in the Deathly Hallows, Deathly Hallows and the Half-Blood Prince, I think he's fairly important, but kind of...
J.K. Rowling made them not cut that character.
Yeah, exactly. And things like that she set up, firstly. Secondly, yes, I'm a die-hard, just huge fan of the casting of Harry Potter. As a film lover and partial filmmaker in general, I'm a huge advocate of when you're making a universe, something like especially a fantasy universe, to try to cast as unknown as possible, and I think that was just really very effective with Harry Potter. All 3 of them, I believe, were fairly unknown. One of them, I can never remember which one of them had some formal training as an actor.
Daniel Radcliffe was in a TV David Copperfield.
Okay, so it must be him, but they were in general just found very sort of happenstancely. Many years ago watched the behind the scenes of when they were little, and they were like, and I was just doing this, and all of a sudden...
they're kids, they don't have an established career.
Yeah, they're like, and then I'm in Harry Potter, and I'm 11, so, at one time I knew, but, and even just in general, I think the casting for the adults is done fantastically well. This is probably really...
I don't like Alan Rickman, though.
Don't
horrible,
say these
terrible.
No.
No, I'm sorry. That
You
joke
play
is wearing
evil.
really that joke is wearing really thin. I know. No, Alan Rickman's amazing. He was
I'm
arguably
sad
the
that
best
he's
of the
dead.
adults in the movies.
Yeah, I
I'm
still
sad
can't.
that he's not with us anymore.
I know. Oh, it breaks
Oh,
my
he
heart.
is though. He's in the movies
Right.
with
Okay.
us.
I'll bet the Academy wishes that they'd given him an Oscar now.
Yeah. Gosh, and
After it's too fucking late.
Okay.
So sorry.
No, I was
Continue.
just gonna comment to your choice on Prisoner of Azkaban. I'm glad you chose that because for me that's the movie that made me care about this series.
Mhm.
I didn't go into the first 3 films as a Harry Potter fan. I've never read the books, blah blah blah, and I would have to admit that I went into it already not liking Chris Columbus. I don't like him as a director.
Reasonably so.
I don't like him as a creative director or whatever. But I tried to enjoy these films as much as I could, but I just couldn't quite get into the series with films 1 and 2. But number 3 is the one that made me care about the series, so I think it deserves a mention.
It was the first one that felt truly cinematic.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
You know?
for sure.
And that's what I was going to say is like bringing, so J.K. Rowling setting up the characters, the first crew, and major sort of like exec people working with 1 and 2 Harry Potter, Chris Columbus being involved, I guess, in the casting.
The producer or executive producer on the third one.
Yeah,
as well.
I think that was very important for setting up the success of the remainder of the series, and then bringing Alfonso Cuarón being the third part in adding that cinematic element that we all have seen in now things like Gravity that he's just really in tune with, and even like I said again, very much so leaning on Nerdwriter here, who is a YouTube channel. Video essay guy. That's probably not the best way to introduce him.
I've seen it.
For those listening, but he says, oh gosh, I just lost it. Oh, here we go. Alfonso Cuarón's movie right before he did Harry Potter: The Prisoner of Azkaban was like a sensual road journey story.
It was Y tu mamá también.
Yeah,
right?
I guess I didn't know. I didn't hear the title in the video essay, but I believe you, and that it was. Not much like Harry Potter, I'd say. Very much so more about sexual identity, I guess. And Ben apparently knows the name of the film. I don't know much about it past that.
But I've only seen one scene of it. I have to admit. But it's also I believe it's about young kids. So
Oh, okay.
he had an affinity for
youth.
yeah.
Coming of age, maybe.
Still a little bit of a surprising choice following Christopher Columbus. Chris Columbus's films, because they're such different directors.
Well,
why would you go there? I would expect someone like Steven Spielberg.
I know, but one thing you have to remember, and this I think it might explain why, is Warner Brothers back then was getting very, very they were making some big gambles on these eccentric tours. This was around the time that they were hiring Christopher Nolan for Batman Begins, Spike Jonze for Where the Wild Things Are. It was, and John Ottman, who's one of the editors of Superman Returns, talked about doing that film with Warner Brothers and with Bryan Singer, and he was like, yeah, Warner Brothers totally left us alone. Let us do whatever we wanted. So it's, I think it was that was part of their image at the time. We're going to reach out to these eccentric, edgy directors.
I'm glad they did.
I wonder how Warner's are doing. They're losing so much money from the DCEU.
Yeah, Justice League. They're going to lose at least $80 million or something on that. Yeah.
Anyways, that's an off-topic.
Let's not digress there. I'll just get upset.
we can do a whole podcast on the DCEU.
Get into a whole other can of worms. But.
Well, moving along, if we're ready to move on to Patrick, your 2 and 3 pick.
Number 3, The Empire Strikes Back. So throw in my 2 cents following Ben, and then number 2 is Terminator 2. What can I say about Empire that hasn't already been said? So I think going off what Ben said, I agree with just about everything. As a film, as a standalone film, it works very well. Even if I never watched Star Wars, I would have jumped into it as if the series started there just fine. It's hard to say, right? That's all hypothetical crap. But I think why it climbs on my list to number 3. Actually, now that I think about it, perhaps it probably even deserves to be number 1. But I settled on number 3 anyways. But the quality that I'm talking about here is that it really set off a lot of trends that we take for granted today in terms of filmmaking, producing. I think the original Star Wars trilogy was really made because of Empire, and what I said about the Two Towers earlier, and that I think the middle film is so crucial in that it ties together the first and the third films. If it doesn't have a strong second film, then it's very hard to justify the first and the third film, and I think Empire just does very well in that regard for the original trilogy. And I think the original trilogy and Empire also set the trends of building these cinematic universes, releasing film stories in 3 parts, also bringing like science fiction out of the B-movie world and into the mainstream, like real cinematic world. And of course, in and of itself, it's just so well written. It really grew the characters and all this and that. So it's number 3 on my list, and I'll share more later as to why it's not number 1, I suppose. But that's a different topic. So now we're in number 2 and number 1 land. It's hard for me to talk about number 2 without talking about number 1 because of both James Cameron movies, right? But with Terminator 2, I think it was very strong in how it just kind of came out of nowhere. I don't think a lot of people were expecting it. I think Terminator 1 came out 7 years prior. I mean, that's a pretty long gap.
Yeah.
Like to follow up a movie. I mean, I think originally, I haven't watched any like documentaries with Jim Cameron, but I don't know that he ever planned to make a Terminator 2, and I don't even know why they decided to make a Terminator 2 7 years after they made the first film.
Well, if I could just interject one thing, I mean, the craziness to say, I'm going to make a sequel whose budget will be bigger than the entire gross of the first film. I mean, he really believed in it, and he believed he could like grow the audience that much, and he was right.
And what's interesting about Terminator 1 and 2 is not only because of the long gap in between them, it's also because they're such different movies. The first Terminator, in my opinion, is kind of like a B movie. It's one of those old B movie sci-fi movies that came out.
The robot wants to kill the girl.
Yeah, like in the 80s, where it wasn't that relevant, except to, of course, this rabid fan base of it. And then 7 years later, you come up with a sequel that is not a B movie, that was very mainstream, that did very well. It was a bona fide blockbuster, and it stands the test of time. I watch it today, and it's really freaking good.
Oh God, yeah.
It's so action-packed and everything. I mean, I think they released it last year, like a 3D version.
And they wouldn't do it at like Regal or Cinemark, so I didn't get to see
Damn
it.
it!
Yeah, I know. I was so mad.
What
Yeah,
the hell?
I thought about like taking the bus up to Seattle to like see it. You know.
Wow.
It's so good as a blockbuster.
It is. It's amazing. I mean, this movie. It's like it's so cool. It's practically like a drug watching it. Like even on my modestly sized TV, like I just get so pumped. Watching that car chase at the end with the helicopter on the freeway. I mean,
it's just such a fun ride altogether.
Yeah.
The strengths of it, how well crafted it was, and what sets this apart from my previous films, Empire, Two Towers, Dark Knight, is that it doesn't really rely on these these sequel supports, if you want to call it that. Like, there's no expectations of a Terminator 3. It's not really. It's building on Terminator 1, but not so much in terms of audience's expectations, because 7 years have passed. majority of the people who went into T2 probably never even watched Terminator 1. You know, it's that strong as a standalone film.
In fact, I'm certain that's the case.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes it such a unique sequel. It's one of the most unique sequels that I can think of in terms of its popularity, how well it's made, how well received, and the fact that it stands the test of time even now. It's one of the greatest in terms of Hollywood blockbusters. You know, it's one of the best ones ever made, and I think it's slightly better than Empire in that regard. I think to me Empire is more of a there's a lot of cultural significance and in terms of how movies are made, but as a film, I think T2 is probably stronger than Empire as a film. So that's where that stands.
I haven't seen Terminator 2 in a long time, and I do have to say that your guys' rave reviews has made me want to revisit it soon, just so I can get in on this excitement, because I know I've seen it, and I know I like it, because I went through a Terminator phase.
Everybody does.
I watched like a lot of Terminator movies in this weird period of time from like age 9 to 11, and then I think after that, whatever number it is, came out with Christian Bale, right? Isn't it Christian Bale?
Terminator Salvation.
Yeah.
The one directed by Mick G.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Or whatever he calls himself.
Once that came out, I remember seeing like 3/4 of it and just being like, this is weird. And then just never revisited anything Terminator like. It's nothing against, the first two, which are amazing, from what I remember.
Well, it's kind of like as opposed to like Star Wars, which is this like great concept that like a lot of different directors have been able to deal with. It's like Terminator. It's like, I don't know that the concept is that interesting without James Cameron. I mean, to me, James Cameron is Terminator.
Yeah.
James Cameron is.
I know. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true. I mean, I think what makes Terminator is his passion, his visual storytelling, his mastery of structure. I mean, very few people can structure a story as well as he can.
Man. On that note, unless.
Before we move on, I had a comment that I wanted to make before I. No, you know what? We'll save that for the end, actually. So let's
mystery.
Go ahead and
Okay,
I like it.
Something to look forward to.
Moving right along to Ben, then. What's 2 and 3 for you?
Okay, well, again, I have a controversial pick and an uncontroversial pick, but they're in the opposite order this time. I'm doing the uncontroversial pick first. Yeah, number 3 for me is X2. I am a big fan of the X-Men franchise. The first one, I thought, introduced a really interesting idea, which is where Magneto, Ian McKellen's character, says, for the few people who don't know the X-Men franchise, it's about humans versus mutants. Humans hate mutants. It's a metaphor for racism and all kinds of bigotry. And Magneto, Ian McKellen's character, says, there's a war coming with humans. But it's really all theoretical, because the first X-Men is about, kind of inter-mutant clashes, and like they're deciding how to deal with the humans, how to respond to the bigotry. X2 takes that all away. It shows the bigotry in full force. We see human soldiers come into Charles Xavier's school for mutants. We see them shoot these children. We see them scatter the X-Men. See them going on the run. See them having to defend their lives against genocide, basically. And it's as opposed to the first movie, which is an intellectual debate. This is like, well, there's no time for that. We have to survive. We have to do whatever it takes, and they do. But at the end, just when they think they've won, just when they think everything's going to be okay, they face a new challenge and lose one of the most important members of the X-Men. And so a story that was going to end on a high note instead ends with its characters grieving and ends with them shaken. And it all comes down to this great scene where Charles Xavier, played by Patrick Stewart, is in the White House, saying to the president, there are humans and mutants alike who believe a war is coming. Some have tried to start one, and already there have been casualties. And kind of suggesting this idea, hey, maybe Magneto was wrong. Maybe there doesn't have to be a war. Maybe we can change that, because look at the fighting already, and look at what has been lost. Look at the lives lost. Look at the pain inflicted. And I think that's a powerful thing. The first X-Men, kind of introduces the idea of the bigotry, the prejudice, but doesn't really make you feel it. X2 makes you feel it, and makes you feel the importance of going beyond that. And before I get on to my second position pick, I do want to acknowledge some real-world stuff outside the movie. I'm sure most of our listeners, I'm sure both of you know about the allegations against Bryan Singer, who directed X-Men. He's been accused of sexual misconduct multiple times, and as much as I love the movie, I think one of the saddest things is the idea that this director who was preaching tolerance, preaching compassion, was not allegedly practicing it in his own life, and I think that's a real betrayal. And while I want to celebrate the greatness of the movie, I think it's important to call attention to that hypocrisy, because the wrongness of it is pretty massive. Moving on to a happier note, my second place pick it explains my outfit, which those of you who are listening can't see, but Laura alluded to earlier. I'm wearing a black turtleneck. I'm wearing one black glove. I've got a green lightsaber.
Who is he, folks?
I'm Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi. Although sadly I have not yet learned how to use the Force. I'm still waiting for the that first tingle. But
the letter in the mail and an owl. Wait.
Yeah.
Harry Potter
universe mashup. This is an interesting thing, because I know Return of the Jedi has its flaws. It's not perfect. But when I really looked in the mirror and was honest with myself, I realized this is the Star Wars movie that moves me the most. And that's because of the journey Luke Skywalker takes, going from the beginning to the end. And I think it's really fascinating, the idea that, Empire sets up this more morally complex universe. Return of the Jedi is about the challenge of living in that universe. Luke is told by Yoda, by Obi-Wan, both of his masters, you have to face your father, you have to kill him, and Luke has now learned from his two mentors, and he's fought against them and accepted the wisdom, but he's like, hey, I have the confidence now to believe in something better. I believe I can save Darth Vader, and the film is really at its core about that journey, and having that being tested. He tries to save Darth Vader. Darth Vader's like, nope, I'm taking you to the Emperor. Luke is like, okay, I can deal with this as long as I know that, I'm going to die with Vader and the Emperor when the rebels attack. The Emperor takes that away from him too when he reveals, hey, this is all a trap. We're going to slaughter them with our quote-unquote, unoperational Death Star. And Luke gives into then his reaction is to give into anger. Okay, I'm going to fight him. Then Darth Vader, stands up for his master, of all people, forcing Luke, what he didn't want to do from the beginning, fight his father. And then he realizes the only thing I can do to not become him is to not fight at all, but throw away my lightsaber. And in the end, that's what finally inspires Darth Vader to let go of the dark side. And I think that's such a beautiful thing. But I also think it's significant that, in the first film, Luke was the one who got to destroy the Death Star. In Return of the Jedi, he goes on a much more intimate journey where he doesn't, get to save the whole Rebel Alliance. He gets to save one person, and in the end, it's not even saving his life, it's just saving him morally, because Vader dies. And I love how it all comes down to the scene where, he's burning his father's body, and the same music is playing as when he looked up at the twin sons in the first film, longing for adventure. And I like to think that he's thinking in that moment, what a stupid kid I was, because this is adventure, this is life, this is loving people and losing people, this is, dealing with pain. And yet, he also knows that it is about joy as well. And in the end, he goes back, he celebrates with his friends, again, that Ewok dance party. And the last shot of the trilogy is, him kind of posing with Han and Leia and Lando and Chewie, almost like, they're posing for a family photo, because that's what it is. And I think, that last scene is my favorite scene in all of Star Wars. It's a big part of why I love Return of the Jedi.
There's a comment that we were talking about the prequel trilogies earlier. I think one of the complications with the Star Wars films, all of them, not just the original trilogy, but the prequel trilogy and now the sequel trilogy, is that I just thought of this earlier, how there's all the canon films, 1 through 8 now, they're all kind of deliberately made to be welcoming to children. But at the same time, if you think of the title Star Wars, war is a very adult theme. So how do you take something that is so adult and so violent and make that palatable to children? I think that's going to always be one of the main central conflicts in Star Wars. But I think it's also interesting that with your list, you selected Star Wars, Return of the Jedi and Empire as sequels. You put Return of the Jedi above Empire.
It surprised me. I did not expect to do that, and I would not have done that a few years ago. But I kind of went through a period where I was sort of embarrassed to admit that Jedi was my favorite. I was like, no, I can't. It's just, it's not cool, Ewoks, and then I was like, man, I know it's not perfect, I know that maybe there's a little too much of the Ewoks and the Jabba creatures, and maybe not enough of our main characters. But I was like, this is the one that affects me. This is the one that really sums up a lot of what I love about Star Wars. But I think it's really interesting. You make such a great point, Patrick, about the idea that how do you it is Star Wars. How do you make that palatable to children? And I think Return of the Jedi is an example of how hard a line it is to walk, because they get the Ewoks and honestly, I now consider myself an Ewok apologist. I think they're really charming. I think they're funny. To the Ewok haters, I say Yugnub. But at the same time, then you have this just horribly disturbing scene where two Ewoks are running and one of them gets killed and one's Ewoks over the other body going mama. It's that's really twisted. That's horrible. They killed an Ewok mother. It's you see kind of the cuteness of the Ewoks and kind of the harshness of the violence of Star Wars intersecting, and it's a pretty delicate mixture to have to work through. You're right.
I think it's interesting the way you think of Star Wars in contrast to how you think of X-Men, because I noticed you put Return on top of above Empire, yet you put X2 above X3.
Yes. Yeah. That's it's kind of for me it's
because they're different. I would say the middle films are a different beast compared to third films.
Yes,
so it's kind of interesting how you
you
made the difference between X-Men and Star Wars.
Yeah. For if there were another good X-Men sequel, I would certainly consider putting it in there.
Ooh, that was just a very backhanded compliment sort of thing. If there was one, I would pick it.
But honestly, I think X3 is just painful to watch, man. It's
I agree.
It's tough. It's a tough sit, and I really like X-Men Days of Future Past. I think that's a very solid popcorn picture, but it's for me it felt kind of watered down compared to X1 or X2. It felt it's kind of they were trying to make X-Men more just kind of a normal action movie, and so as much as I like it, I didn't consider it. But you raise a good point, yeah, it was in this. I was thinking, doing this list, do I only have one from each franchise? But then I was like, I'm gonna mix in some sequels and some threequels, because that's where my heart wants to go.
Okay.
Well, on that note, does everyone feel good about moving right along?
Yep.
I do feel good about it.
I feel pretty good too. So I feel like on the note of violence, my number 4 pick, potentially, I'm just going to shift some things around sort of on the spot.
Whoa!
Just to make it work. My number 4 pick.
Or number 3?
Number 3 pick. What did I already talk about? I'm already confused.
Phantom Menace and Prisoner of Azkaban.
Prisoner of Azkaban. Yes, I just wrote 3 and 4 twice instead of... I didn't write a 2. So, yes.
Behind the scenes at T.H.O. movie review.
Behind the scenes, Laura doesn't know numbers. So my actual number 3 pick in this instance is going to be Kill Bill Volume 2.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of violence, where else can you go but a Tarantino movie for just some unnecessary extra violence, right? And honestly, that's why Kill Bill Volume 2 is not only one of my favorite movies of all time, and I use that word loosely, it's more like top 20, top 30, being up there in the favorites. It's one of my favorites because out of all the Tarantino movies, I personally feel like it's the one with the least violence, or least unnecessary violence. I think Kill Bill Volume 2 really complements Kill Bill Volume 1 in exploring Uma Thurman's character, Beatrix Kiddo's feelings and emotion in regard to the way David Carradine's character, Bill, treated her when she chose to leave him to find a better life for their unborn child, and how he sought out and killed her whole wedding entourage and, as far as we know it, her child as well, and nearly killed her. She barely survives and comes back with a vengeance, and in the first movie, you do see this vengeance. You see her waking up and, going about hunting down the people who have wronged her, with Bill being the last of her list. But in Kill Bill Volume 1, especially in the final, I can never remember, something 88. It's the 88 of the, Asian sort of swordsman dudes that she's gonna slaughter in like a 5-minute sequence. That when blood is spurting everywhere, that's just the sort of very extraness of Tarantino that I feel like we're used to. And then in Kill Bill Volume 2, you don't really see so much of that sort of violence, and you do see a bit more of reflection on her past and, her experience early on with Bill and their relationship and becoming the sort of apprentice to Bill's mentor. Bill's, I'm not sure if it's karate or martial arts, sort of Zen mentor that she goes to and studies under, and the test it does on her body and mind, and that's how she becomes this, very hard, skilled assassin that's able to complete the tasks that she feels necessary in the first and second installments of Kill Bill. And I think that her personal confrontation, the closer and closer it gets to Bill himself, with the blonde girl, forgive me, I can never remember her character name, blonde girl with eye patch, and...
it wasn't Daryl Hannah.
Yeah, Daryl.
Was it? Okay, Daryl Hannah.
Okay.
And Daryl Hannah being the newfound lover and apprentice of Bill, and then Bill's brother, becoming more intimate until she reaches Bill himself and confronts him to find that her child was not killed, but has been living with Bill this whole time. And, I think that moment is something that when I was first viewing the films, I never expected, that really was satisfying for me in that sort of journey she's been on. I think had that not been there, had she just found Bill and, killed him in some sort of, I'm sure, overtly violent way, I would have not found Kill Bill Volume 1 or 2 to be something that I'd revisit or think about past having seen it the first time. It would just be kind of... I'm quite a big fan of Tarantino and most of his films, and not as much recently as I have been in the past, especially his earlier films, and films that he maybe didn't direct but wrote for, or vice versa. But I think just that addition of sort of, the ultimate plot twist, the thing that's been driving this character throughout 2 movies, you killed me and you killed our child, or tried to kill me, and, I'm back with a vengeance, but part of that isn't true, that the child survived, and it really reasserts that Bill is now more of a person. She seems to feel somewhat reluctant in killing him, or in some sort of withdrawn emotion, that previously it was pure revenge, the motive was clear, now there's something that's a bit gray, and I think that's really interesting. I really appreciate what that did for me and my Tarantino experience.
I like that you brought up Kill Bill Volume 2, because I think it exemplifies a different type of sequel compared to what we've already talked about. Kill Bill, it's deliberately called Volume 2, so it was meant to be like a follow-up. I mean, you could watch, I personally, in my mind, I think of them as one film, just split into 2, and there's no third part.
Yeah.
So, that's a very unique experience. There's not a lot of those films out.
Unfortunately, because I'm a big fan of that sort of intentional split.
Yeah.
To really give, when more time is needed to cover a story.
I think it's necessary, actually. I think it's a type of sequel that isn't pursued enough. Because what I'm seeing with a lot of movies, an example, I've talked about this before, is Man of Steel. I think Man of Steel would have benefited from the Kill Bill treatment, where they split it in 2. Because it's one of those movies where there was just so much going on that in order for them to cram it all into one movie, you're going to have to cut out a lot as well. And it makes for a kind of a jarring experience. And that's one of my criticisms with Man of Steel and why it wasn't as good as it needed to be. Because it probably should have been 2 movies. And I could go off on this even more, and this is also my criticism of Black Panther, actually.
Interesting.
We'll get into that later.
Oh, I don't even know if I want to know. I haven't seen it yet. I'm just going to see it on Sunday.
I'll keep
Don't
keep
spoil here.
But, yeah. There you go. That's my comment on your Kill Bill.
Any more thoughts, Ben?
I was just thinking, like, the idea you're talking about, like, about, like, revenge, that being the kind of the foundational principle of that revenge being taken away, kind of reminds me of Memento a little bit, I mean, obviously Tarantino, Nolan, very different stuff, but I like, that's an idea I've always responded to, because I feel like when you do that, you take a revenge story from being sort of like, an eye for an eye to something more complex, because it's not really interesting if just the character gets their revenge and there are no complications. You want to make them look in the mirror and question what they've done. I think that's a very cool thing.
Yeah. So a side comment on Memento. Did you hear that they're going to be remaking it?
No.
That is
like.
How dare they even consider? Yes, WT. Yeah.
What the hell?
Yeah.
What is wrong with you, Hollywood?
No.
I know.
It's gonna
Go
be
home,
so
Hollywood. You're
bad.
drunk.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Kind of like there is no Terminator without James Cameron. There is no Memento without Christopher Nolan.
It's
that
a
movie was
perfect
pure Nolan. Yeah,
It
it's a
does
perfect
not
movie.
need
There's
to be
no
remade.
need for it to be remade at all.
I'll watch it,
Yeah.
even if it's 100 years old in black and white. It's that good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, on that somewhat depressing note,
That is a depressing note.
I feel like
I've been remaking the
we need to talk about happiness that is derived from Nolan in the form of my second pick, which is The Dark Knight, which I know you've already spoken towards a bit, so hopefully I'm not being too repetitive here. I am, 1, a huge fan of Christopher Nolan. 2, huger fan of Christian Bale. I have seen almost every Christian Bale movie there is, and there's a million, anywhere from Empire of the Sun to, oh my god, it's escaping me at the moment, I'll just fill in the gaps, to Batman, to The Prestige, to Out of the Furnace is the movie that I was thinking of, with Casey Affleck, to American Hustle, just any Christian Bale movie, I'm there, I'm ready to see it, I'm excited, love me some Christian Bale, I just think he has such a range, I heard he's a jerk, in Hollywood, but I'm kind of okay with it. Just
Geniuses
so long.
tend to be jerks.
Just so long as
Yes.
I can absorb the greatness that is on screen, because I just can't get enough. But also, what strikes me the most about The Dark Knight is the thing that is the most obvious and people talk about the most is Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker. Unfortunately, I was never really a comic book kid. It wasn't something that was nostalgic for me, and so when seeing these movies, this was really the first time. I think I'd seen one, pre-Nolan Batman movie, and it's, I can never remember what it's called. It might be Batman Returns. Is it that one with Ivy? Whichever one has Ivy in it.
Wait, are you talking about Batman and Robin?
Maybe.
With the Poison Ivy?
Yes. That's the only one I had seen. Only instance of Batman pre-Nolan.
So pretty different from
Very different.
Joel Schumacher.
That's it. And so I'm just I know that Batman's a thing, and I think my dad introduced me to Batman Begins, and so then The Dark Knight comes out. I'm sure I went to go see it in theaters, and then eventually, much later on, after The Dark Knight Rises had came out, I bought the Blu-ray set for my dad and actually indulged in watching it repetitively whenever I was over at his house, because I just can't get enough. And I think Heath Ledger is one of my favorite actors of all time also, and very sad that he's not with us today. Even 10 Things I Hate About You is one of my favorite sort of Shakespeare revamps, and seeing Heath Ledger kind of from a range of something like 10 Things I Hate About You to Brokeback Mountain to the Joker is a huge evolution as an actor, and I think it's a really great moment that I can revisit him at in his career, and I think it was really outstanding, but kind of diverging from that, because I'm sure people all over the world all the time could rave about Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker and about the brilliance of The Dark Knight, and it's sort of, nice interplay between the maybe more lighthearted origin story, quote unquote, of Batman Begins to the true darkness that we will see in the third one. Though we do not know the darkness, we only adopted it. We were not born in it.
I was born in it.
We should make it clear. I don't claim to know what Bane knows, but another interesting thing that I want to cover is Aaron Eckhart's character as the Two-Face, or Harvey Dent. I do have to openly admit that with some of my closer friends, almost on a weekly basis, you'll hear us say, "Where are they? Where is Harvey Dent?" All the time, just talk about it. It's just the funniest thing, and I get really obsessed with the idea of Harvey Dent, because I kind of like to try in instances of great movies with great actors and great characters, maybe take a peek at the third tier of those characters in that movie and just think about what they do for it. And I think Two-Face is quite literally the perfect visual illustration of The Dark Knight. It's a split between, the awful on one side, the unbearable, and, the clean sort of good presentation that Harvey Dent has in the beginning of the movie. And as I'm referring to The Dark Knight as being this transitional film, I think that sort of symbolism holds really strongly as connecting the maybe quote unquote prettiness of Batman Begins, because it's not necessarily a pretty film. But
it's a romantic film, know, not necessarily in terms of having romance, although there is some of that, but in terms of, style, it's about a young man wandering the world, looking for meaning and finding it ultimately.
And then in the third movie, almost kind of a complete lack of hope in some parts. I know, especially in my first viewing, when Bruce Wayne is in, I can't remember the specific term, the prison. He's first in the prison, you're just like, it's over. He's not going back to Gotham. He's here, he's going to watch it burn. And partly he does. And so, thankfully, he's able to escape and go back and beat Batman. But, prior to that, there's a huge loss of hope for me when Bane beats the crap out of him. And, it was very shocking for me as someone who was very idealized Batman as a character greatly, and his power, to see Bane just thrown to the ground like a little stick or something. So I think, going back to Harvey, that split literally split two-faced of his good side and his bad side, being a really nice illustration of, the theme that the movie is trying to present, what you're going to find in the third movie, what you're already familiar with from the first. And like Patrick has said multiple times now, that it is really important to have a strong center, as a foundation to connect the first and third, because if it's not strong, the third is probably going to be even worse. And then people don't even talk. It's like Pirates of the Caribbean. You might only talk about the first one at that point and push the others aside.
When there's a line in the Dark Knight Rises where Bruce is kind of hallucinating and seeing Ra's al Ghul, and he says, you yourself fought the decadence of Gotham for years, but with all your moral authority, all you could achieve was a lie. And the Dark Knight was what made it possible for him to come back in the third one and feel what was it all for? I had this dream at the beginning. Did I fail that? And that's really powerful. But another thing I wanted to ask you about, and you too, Patrick, if you want to weigh in on this, I think a big part of why the Dark Knight is so good is the scenes on the ferries. And I wonder, what you two think about those scenes and the
there's just a lot of complexity in the writing, right?
Yes,
It's not just a superhero film. Prior to Nolan's treatment of Batman, we're so used to the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies and the X-Men X2 movies. This is Nolan's approach to these movies is he pushed it, right?
It's film noir, it's crime
he
film.
put so much complexity into it where you don't even have to be a comic book fan or a Batman fan, but you'll still enjoy this movie because there's enough complexity in it.
Arguably, especially with The Dark Knight, because it's it could almost be just a normal crime film.
Right, exactly.
There's not the Batman mythology with
Yeah, take away Batman. It'll just be a guy dressed up as a ninja. Being a vigilante.
Totally,
And sort of speaking towards the ferry scene, which I often kind of forget. It's just not because it's forgettable, because I think there's so much to cover when you're talking about Nolan and Batman.
Yeah.
But I think it even plays to what I've kind of already spoken of the dynamic of the two. There's two ferries. It's one with all the criminals, one with the quote unquote normal people. Who has to take the sacrifice. And I think that again is just a really overt form of symbolism for the big Batman question in general, right or wrong, and, is vigilante heroism right? Mm-hmm. Or is it good? And it makes you, but in the opposite almost makes you question, is bad bad? Does bad deserve to be, ultimately extinguished? You have this whole, ferry full of criminals. Do they deserve to die? And then equally in comparison, how good can you even claim that these normal people are? I don't think they really explore it in the movie that much, but I think any person watching might think, or I'd hope would think, well, how do we know everyone just because they're not prisoners on that ferry are inherently good people? It's kind of made to seem that way, in the way that Harvey Dent, even after his death, is made to seem like he was the hero when he was not. He lost it.
The shining example of justice, if we're to quote Bane again.
If we're just going to keep on quoting.
To me, in The Dark Knight, that was probably one of the best third act plot twist I've ever seen, because we're building up the Joker as the bad guy, but he turns the tables on everybody. Am I really the bad guy here?
Or is it you?
Or is society just so fucked up? Well, you guys need a villain and a good guy.
Well, and it kind of there's just a wonderful line where, and it's delivered in such a kind of grandiose way, but I actually think it's really serious. When Harvey Dent says, you thought we could be decent men in an indecent time. I think that's so interesting. The idea things are so corrupt at that point that he feels like it's impossible to be good anymore, and that's a scary thing, and that feels so true coming from him. Makes it mean so much more when to have Batman say, no, we can do better. It's a powerful story.
And I think it deserves a high spot on your list. I mean, I think I put it at number 5, and the only reason why it's on number 5 is because of these other movies that I'm talking about, but I think it deserves very high praise as a sequel film.
I think you said it exactly how I was going to say it. You know, it even the fact that it provokes this much discussion between the three of us here, you know, serves that it's a really well done sequel, a really well done addition to a series already so popular just by its origin.
You want to know how impactful or how masterful a movie is, you know, you listen to the way people talk about it. And it's been almost 10 years. And listen to the conversation we're having because of that one movie, you know?
It's one of those movies that aged very well, and it'll continue. It's a classic now.
Oh, yeah.
Now let's go ahead and just move on to our number 1 pick. It's the one we all really want to talk about, so I'm sure it won't be very hard. Patrick, again, up first.
So let me just do a short recap. My number 5, Two Towers. 4, Dark Knight. 3, Empire Strikes Back. Number 2, Terminator 2, Judgment Day. So what I ended up putting on the top of this list, which was a difficult decision to make, but I would have to go with Aliens, released in 1986, which is also a James Cameron movie, just like Terminator 2. The reason why I would put Aliens on top of T2 is, first of all, I feel that I don't think T2 would have been what it was if Aliens hadn't been released yet. I think a lot of the qualities that Jim Cameron put into T2, he actually started out doing in Aliens. But what makes Aliens so unique is that it takes something that was an established idea from Ridley Scott. What was the first Aliens movie was released in 1979.
Right.
First Alien, completely different movie from Aliens. Different style, different in almost everything. I would almost have to. It's almost as if Aliens is like both a sequel and a reboot. It rolled into one. On top of all of this, you know, it still stands on its own. It's a really well put together film. It's a whole lot of fun. I think it's not the definitive blockbuster, but it's one of those films that really define what a successful blockbuster is. It just is number 1 in on my list for now. And as I was saying at the beginning of this podcast, it doesn't mean that it's that much better than all the other movies on my list. It's just such a unique movie. As in terms of what a sequel is and what it should be, that I put it at the first place, above all the others. So
it's very it's something very like economical and pure about it too. You know, just the idea that there's these people trapped on this planet and they have to survive. You know, and then the journey from, you know, kind of her being terrified at the beginning to sort of like, or Ripley, I mean, coming into her own at the end. That's actually kind of he came back to that idea in T2, and you know, I like what you say about Aliens being, you know, well, there would be no T2 without Aliens. You know, well, he needed to kind of, you know, explore that idea first, so he could come back to it on solid footing. Maybe.
I would almost, in some ways, it's almost as if Aliens was like a trial run or a practice run for Terminator 2. Like,
Sure.
I'm not sure that Jim Cameron would have got the funding for T2 if he didn't make Aliens such a resounding success that it was.
Maybe Aliens in a way was his proof of concept.
Yeah,
one might
probably.
say.
I mean, a lot of like the
like
action sequences, his approach to the storytelling. There's a lot of similarities with Aliens and Terminator 2. To me, these are like the top 2. Maybe not the top 2, but definitely on the top. Jim Cameron being at the top of his game in making these blockbusters. Of course, I'm not taking anything away from his other movies, but yeah. There we go.
I just have to know, so I've heard you talk about James Cameron quite a bit. What are your thoughts on Blue Avatar? I'm a huge fan, so I'm not asking critically. I just need to know.
Did you say Blue Avatar?
Yeah, I always like to say Blue Avatar to distinguish from Avatar: The Last Airbender.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't see Avatar or Blue Avatar as his best movie. I think he was more interested in developing his 3D technology.
Yeah.
I feel like Avatar is the story, the film itself, the story, it was second to what he was doing with the 3D technology. I think he was more interested in the technology personally. I enjoyed it the first time I saw it. That's probably just because it's the first viewing experience, but it doesn't hold up very well on follow-up viewings. Like I saw it the second time in IMAX, I think, and I was like, yeah, it was okay. And then years down the road, like a couple of years later, it's like, oh, this is not that good.
Well, I guess
And
we
it's-
can agree to disagree because I find it very rewatchable, but I understand the sentiment, you know.
Well, I'll weigh in on Avatar
Okay.
if we're talking Avatar. I mean, I'm kind of two minds on it. I think like I have a lot of issues with it. I think the biggest issue I have is like I appreciate the idea that James Cameron is an innovator, that he always wants to push things forward, but at the same time, like, you know, you look at like Terminator 2 or Aliens or you know, Titanic as well, which is my favorite James Cameron film, one of my favorite films of all time. You know, those are very tactile movies. You know, like there is CGI, but it's only used to kind of like supplement, you know, what's been shot, and I feel like, you know, going the fully CG world, like something was a little bit lost. You know, like it felt a little airless at times. But then on the other hand, funnily enough, I was just rewatching Avatar yesterday, and I gotta say, while I do have a lot of problems with it, I think it is really engrossing and really entertaining and even moving at times. And I feel like, you know, even though I have qualms about the visual stuff, like kind of the same things that draw me to these other films, like, you know, really compelling story structure and strong, you know, editing to generate suspense and drama, like that's all still there, you know. So it's like I guess I maybe come in between
In the middle somewhere.
the two of you.
When I say that it's not his best film, I'm not saying that it's a bad movie. I still think it's actually really well put together. I think one of the big stumbling blocks for me is just personal. Personally, I'm not really. I had trouble being invested in what's the main character who's
Jake Sully, yeah.
Yeah, and the guy who's like kind of disappeared. Like, how come he's not making movies
Yeah,
anymore?
it's Sam Worthington.
Yeah, Sam Worthington. I had.
He's been in a couple things, but nothing really wildly popular, I'd say.
Yeah, well, that's kind of James Cameron. Like, he can kind of like, he can find some magic in like someone that like no one else can find. I feel like
it's just that his character to me just wasn't that interesting. And secondly, I had to see him as a human and a blue avatar. It's kind of like, how would I say this? It's kind of like miscasting an animated film, I think.
Sure.
It just didn't fit for me. I don't know if maybe it's a casting thing, but I don't know. I don't think the main character really hit it out of the park for me, and then that was just a problem for me.
Well, we can forgive you, I guess. But we should probably move along to, if there's no more to say about your top pick, Ben. Let's hear about yours.
I could say more about Avatar, but I will move on. Because I have even more to say about my favorite sequel of all time. This was this was a real like journey, you know, picking these films for me, because, you know, like I traditionally thought that my favorite sequel of all time is X2, and I thought about like why I like it, and I was thinking, like, you know what, like I like X2 for a lot of like kind of intellectual reasons, like about the quality of the filmmaking and the way they explore certain themes, and I was like, gosh, can I really put that at the top of my list? Because it seems like at the top of my list should be a movie that like really moves me on a gut level, where I just adore the characters and, you know, and love the movie because of their story. And so I had to pick Spider-Man 2. And when I said that, you know, if you're listening out there and you immediately thought Jamie Foxx, all in blue, shooting lightning. Shame on you! That's not Spider-Man 2!
We're talking about the real Spider-Man 2.
We're talking about the real Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 begins 2 years after the first Spider-Man film, and it explores the consequences of a choice Peter Parker made at the end of the first one, which is that he decides that he can't be with the love of his life, Mary Jane, played by Kirsten Dunst, because it puts her in danger from supervillains. And, he very, nobly walks away from her with the music pounding, dun, 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 and it's like, yes, he's selfless, he's giving up his personal desires for the greater good. Spider-Man 2 is the movie that shows, yeah, that's easier said than done. It's all fine to do that, and it's a noble thing to do, but can you actually live that way? Can you live this monk-like existence? And the movie is sort of about showing that you can't, and watching him get more and more miserable. He's behind on his rent, he's behind on his schoolwork, He said he was going to walk away from Mary Jane, but he loves her. He can't help, reaching out to her, and the more he does, the more it messes with her head and disappoints her, and it all comes down to the point where he says to essentially the ghost of his Uncle Ben, who of course died in the first film. That's the reason he becomes Spider-Man. He says, I can't live your dreams anymore. I want a life of my own. And so he does. He gives up the mantle of Spider-Man, but the movie's also about the fact that doesn't work either, and he has to find a way to uphold his responsibilities to humanity as a whole, to be there for people, not just his own family, but strangers, who may need his help. But at the same time, live a life that's filled with love and joy and happiness, and he has to find a way to walk that line. And I think the greatest scene in the whole film is he's fighting with Doc Ock, the villain played by Alfred Molina, on top of a train, which, although the film was shot in New York, the train part is from Chicago. New York has Chicago elevated trains in this movie. It works in the comic book Marvel reality.
This is the sand villain, right?
This is the Doc Ock, the with metal arms.
Doc Ock. With
Yeah.
Okay.
And so he saves the people on the train. He beats Doc Ock. He's unmasked. And I think the most beautiful moment in the movie is the people on the train looking down at him and saying, "Wow, he's just a kid." And like the idea that people see him for the first time not as a hero, but as a human being, and the idea that just like this connection with these strangers and them understanding what he gives up for them, and they in turn protect him. It's just such a beautiful exchange, and I just love the movie is really all about connection. How do you reach out to people? How do you be there for them? And I love the idea that at the end, kind of going against the end of the first film, Mary Jane says, "Hey, if we're going to be together, I know there will be risks, but I want to face them with you." And the idea that she's taking on a certain responsibility as well, and I think it's just such a beautiful romantic story, and it ends with him, swinging off as Spider-Man, but it's not like the first one where he was, swinging off alone. This time he's swinging toward, a life that's going to be full, not with just self-flagellating responsibility, but with happiness and with friends and family. And I think it's a wonderful story. Spider-Man 2.
I have to point out the really satisfying visual pun of it being a movie of connections and how to make connections, and you have a character who can quite literally connect himself to anything with a super strong spidey web. He can make those connections literally, but you're speaking towards the figurative, of course.
Of course. But I like that you point in that direction. But the powers are a great metaphor. Like there's the idea that he's losing his powers in the film. That's a big part of the plot. Mm-hmm. And I once read someone who said we'll never find out why he's losing his powers. I thought, oh, come on, you know why. He's losing his powers because the more isolated he gets, the more, as a hero, impotent he becomes and ineffective. And he understands the idea that, he's losing his powers because his heart isn't in it, and I like the idea that like toward the end of the film when he says, like, I have this responsibility to uphold, I have to give up my dreams to be there for the rest of humanity. Even though he doesn't have his powers at this point, he kind of knows it's like, well, if I believe in it again, I can get them back. And I think that's a really clever metaphor.
Yeah, it is.
Laura, are you ready? I'm so sorry.
I know what you're saying, but it's not nearly as anticipated as my first choice for best sequel of all time, which I'm practically like shaking of excitement to talk about and to see some hopefully controversial feelings. And it's no less than the 2012 Prometheus film by Ridley Scott.
So Ridley.
Yeah, I mean, Prometheus to me is one of my favorite films, and like I said, I use that word pretty loosely, but in this context it's more like top 10 than top 20. Prometheus is probably, again, one of the handful of 10 films that I've seen more than about 15 times at least at this point. It's one of those movies that I can just have on in the background and play over and over and over again, and it's largely because of so many reasons, but largely because of its visual wonder, as I like to call it. It was nominated, I think, for some sort of visual award, visual effects.
Yeah.
I don't think it took it home. I'm not certain. It might have, but regardless.
Life of Pi.
Life of Pi, yeah, whatever.
Ooh, Ang Lee, burn.
I did also like Life of Pi, but I like Prometheus umpteenth times more than I like Life of Pi. And I definitely was rooting for it when I was watching the Oscars at home that year by myself. I was yelling, all alone. I'm sure the neighbors thought that there was a commotion. But anyways, the visual wonder of Prometheus I constantly find being really something that's like ubiquitous, I'd say. And when I say ubiquitous, I don't mean throughout the movie, which it is, but I mean more specifically throughout the frame. That I feel like my eye is drawn past whatever the center of focus is to explore, the world outside of whatever's in the center, whatever it's the character or a ship or an object, whatever is being focused on. I think there's so much going on within each shot that is really engaging and interesting and wondrous. It's really a great example, I feel like, of fantasy in a fantasy world. And the biggest controversy about Prometheus is that people just don't, it is a prequel for those of us listening that might not know. It's a prequel to Alien, and it's also directed by Ridley Scott, as Alien was, and that's interesting to me specifically since Ridley Scott didn't direct the sequel to Alien. It was James Cameron, so I always found that really interesting that he chose to return for the prequel, but not for a sequel, or I think it's, there's 4 following the original Alien, and I don't think he directed any of them that I can remember. They're all different directors. But he chooses to return for this, and I think he brings that keen Ridley Scott fantasy eye that we find in movies like Alien and Blade Runner, that I'm really a huge fan of. And, I could go on and on forever about the directorial eye and the cinematographical eye. Cinematographical, not a word also, but, just making up words.
It can be
here.
a word. It can be a word. Who says it isn't?
The second most important thing about this film to me is really the character of David, played by Michael Fassbender. Michael Fassbender is another actor like Christian Bale for me, who I love to see on the screen. I love to see anything that they're in as something as grandiose and maybe blockbuster-esque as X-Men First Class, to even the smallest appearance in Band of Brothers. He's in there for like 2 seconds. You barely see him. But I just think he's such a clever actor. He's so smart. I think especially in the way that he controls his face, and in playing the character of David, I think he does a fantastic job of creating this eerie facial expression that is so entirely AI to me that I just can't get enough of it. And the most interesting contrast between David's character and, if anyone knows the name, I'm sure one of you does, of the original AI in Alien, his name is...
Was it Bishop?
Bishop, okay. So
in Aliens. I forget. I'm not sure if Bishop was an alien.
Because he dies, he like perishes.
Isn't there a new bishop in Aliens?
Yeah, there's.
Because it's Lance Henriksen again.
Yeah, it's Lance. Was he an alien? I can't remember.
I don't know. Oh, I thought he was because doesn't Ripley like freak out when she sees him in Aliens? Like, we had one of these. And
yeah,
my
something
ship
like that.
betrayed
It's
me.
been a while.
Let's just say it's Bishop. If we're wrong, someone please comment on this video below and let us know.
Yes, yes.
But let's say Bishop, and I noticed immediately that in Alien, it's this mystery. He's just a normal member of the crew, and you find out, at a later point in the movie that he's AI. He's artificial intelligence. And in Prometheus, it's one of the opening scenes. After you see the pre-title sequence of the engineer coming to Earth. Pre-existence of man, but post-title sequence, it's one of the first scenes that you are introduced to David, and you soon learn that he's AI. And I think that sort of choice was made by Ridley Scott very intentionally, to reveal that earlier on, and you're knowing throughout the entire time that there's an AI as part of the crew, which I just found to be a completely different experience, kind of a couple different ways, but, and another thing I wanted to talk about, just have to revisit my notes here, calling myself out, of David's sort of just humanizing obsessions, like his humanizing obsession with Lawrence of Arabia, the movie, dyeing his hair and reciting lines from it, is showing that he sees there's something about the human character as portrayed through this film, and finds it appealing as something that he wants to replicate and mimic. And then, secondly, his obsession with Elizabeth Shaw and her attitude of choosing to believe in whatever she chooses to believe as being her religion. And I find that as being something that David finds really attractive, because he kind of craves the autonomy, potentially, to have that choice to want to believe, or to have feelings about believing in something, and he seems very aware that he's been created for a purpose, and he does enact wanting to, do what he's been made to do, but I feel like there's also an eerie part of him that is trying to break away from that and has his own sort of menacing motives. And I could go on and on forever just about, Charlize Theron's sort of like indestructible qualities up until she's faced with the engineer ship that squashes her down, to be less than nothing, before she's the largest power that we're seeing within the human sphere. And just in general, Elizabeth Shaw's character's big statement towards choosing to believe, I've always found really, really engaging in this sort of dialogue about religion, belief, spirituality, all that jazz.
What makes me sad about what Ridley Scott is doing is how the third film is kind of in limbo because of the whole 20th Century Fox sale.
Oh, yeah.
I think they officially canned the third film, but that doesn't mean it's never going to be made. It's just because there's a lot of ownership issues going on. But I like where Ridley Scott is taking this series as a sci-fi story. It's really intriguing.
You liked Covenant a lot, right?
I did. I really enjoyed Covenant. How we were doing our year-end best of top 10 or something like that. Or top 5.
Oh, yeah.
I think I put Covenant at like 7 or 8 or something.
Okay.
So, I really enjoyed Covenant, actually. Covenant, to me, was a little more balanced than Prometheus, but I think Prometheus was really interesting with the characters and the story, and the philosophy behind the story and all that was really interesting. It was a little uneven as a film, but I really enjoyed it as well. Yeah, well, what's also interesting is that our top films are in the same universe.
Yeah,
that's right.
I thought the same thing when you shared
yeah.
yours. I was like, this will be interesting,
Yeah.
Well, we're going back in time from Aliens to...
It's funny because Aliens kind of it was Jim Cameron taking the series away from Ridley Scott, and with Prometheus, it's kind of like Ridley Scott's taking it back.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
I have a question for you, Laura.
Go shoot. What's that question?
So I have to confess, I'm not a Prometheus fan.
We know.
I have seen it. I have seen it a lot of times though, because it is very visually compelling, and I do think the Fassbender performance is just extraordinary. I like watching the movie even just for that performance. I do feel that like one thing I have trouble with is like the ending, which is like I kind of feel like at the ending like Ridley Scott's sort of like taking us towards these questions about, you know, the origins of humanity, the meaning of life, and he kind of ends with a lot of it unresolved, and I felt like I needed more at the end myself, but I did hear a really interesting rebuttal where someone was pointing out, you know, well, the first Alien film had mysteries that didn't resolve too. So I was wondering if A, you think I'm crazy, and B, if you agree with that it's like there are mysteries and we should just we should accept that because, you know, that's kind of the nature of the game, or even the nature of life, really.
You know, I definitely do think you're crazy. Maybe not just about Prometheus, but I actually don't think it's quite so ambiguous. I think potentially the audience that finds that confusing or dissatisfying is weighing too much in just at the instant moment of the film that they're engaging with. So in this case, that would be the end. You know, they're just engaging with the end. I feel like if you think about specifically the dialogue, a lot of the conversations that are had between Elizabeth and other characters, you know, she is the main character, and I feel like she often kind of gets left out of this discussion because she's not as strong of a character inherently as Charlize Theron, and she's not as kind of gripping as David, but she's the main character, you know,
right.
And the whole reason they're there is because of her, and the whole reason that she's pursuing this is because of her father and his sort of, I guess, question of religion and the importance of religion, and that he taught her is that she has to make a choice about what her beliefs are going to be, and that believing is more of a choice than just something being true and you're deciding that that's true because, well, it's showing you that it's true. And so if you have a character that throughout the movie is, you know, enacting a choice to believe in, you know, something, in this case it's Elizabeth's choice to believe that the engineers made them for a reason, and she wants to know why, and, you know, she's made that clear to other characters as well, and in the end you kind of hear like, okay, well, now we know we see these engineers, they don't really get to talk to them, but she wants to know why still, you know, she doesn't know, her question isn't answered, so that kind of, I think it's only a given that the movie kind of would also kind of show that the question isn't answered, because her question isn't, but she chooses to believe that there is an answer, essentially. She's kind of going with David off into the sky, very Star Trek-esque, you know, and about to go on to explore the universe, to find the answers to the engineers, and who created them, so on and so forth, and even in Alien Covenant, you see that they did make it to the engineers' planet. It's kind of, I enjoy Alien Covenant, it's kind of dissatisfying then to see that they did make it, but you never really get to see Elizabeth interacting with the engineers in the way that you kind of want her to, you know, to see that conversation, that dialogue, or whatever that would look like. We don't, you know, because it kind of turns into this other story at that point, you know, once Alien Covenant's happening. But I think if you're talking about Prometheus isolated, the ending does make a lot of sense to me. So it's a little bit of both. I think it's just, it's reactionary to the movie in general. The movie, you know, maybe not thinking about Alien as a series or world. You know, Prometheus in one way is just a prequel to this world that already exists, but in another way, I feel like if you're looking at Prometheus on its own, it's a movie about questions of origin, you know? And so I think the ending makes a lot of sense that way. You don't agree, though, I can tell by the furrowed brow.
Well, I mean, I guess, like, I don't know, I think about, like, I don't even know if it's worth getting into, but
Might as well at least make the statement.
Okay,
and then
okay.
Call it good.
So you know how, I mean, you know how, like, we're talking Ridley Scott, like, the first Blade Runner, like, I feel like there's a real, like that movie also ends with a cliffhanger, but I felt like a sense of, completeness, like there's sort of a spine to it, and the spine is like that Rick Deckard starts is, he's really gonna do anything for the quote-unquote man, he's just fulfilling his role in the machine of society, I'll hunt the replicants because that's what they tell me to do. And by the end, he's like moved to a place where it's like, oh, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go on the run. I'm going to protect Rachel. And it's like there's a journey. It's like I don't quite feel that in Prometheus. I almost feel like there's like it's kind of like he was like saving too much for Covenant in a way. I mean, you could argue that maybe that's the point. That it's like, that we're meant to be kind of left, because it's like, because he's taking on these questions that in some ways are unanswerable. Why did humanity emerge? One movie can't really
answer all those questions. I feel like you'd be a bit too on the nose if it was like, well, yep, that's it, folks. Next time on, exploring the origins of humanity,
So I'm of two minds, and that, like, I feel like Prometheus still doesn't quite work for me, but I think some of the more recent criticism, including what you're saying, I think makes a lot of sense. So for all my misgivings, I could certainly be persuaded to give it another try, because I think you make some very, very thoughtful points.
Well, thank you. I choose to believe that I do.
I like
I see what you did.
I like the plot twist that they introduced in Covenant. I think it makes the story a lot more interesting, and my sense is that the third film, if it ever sees the light of day, is that it's going to be even more darker than Covenant, and it's probably going to be closer in tone to the original Alien. And I think he's actually said that he wants to bridge the gap between this prequel trilogy and the first Alien that he did. So it'll probably move more towards horror, which makes a lot of sense because if you look at the arc of the story, it's actually really horrific and macabre.
Yeah.
This prequel trilogy, the opening question is who made the xenomorphs and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's actually a human creation,
yeah.
and it's gonna bring about the demise of humanity.
Yeah.
So it's Ridley Scott's critique of technology, technophilia.
Well, speaking of looking onwards to the future of other sequels coming to be, why don't we just talk about what makes a good sequel?
Yeah, there you go. That's a good segue.
That's a great question. Yeah.
Anybody feeling reary to start?
I think I mentioned earlier that I think the usual rules apply, right? Like, you still got to have a great script, great screenplay, good acting, good directing, and all that. But what makes sequels, same with reboots and things, is that there are audience expectations that you have to manage. You have to take into account what the original film did and what it means, and how to make it worth your while revisiting, right? So, of course, the proof is in the pudding. If you come away from it not feeling like it was a complete waste of time, then I suppose that's a success in and of itself. And of course, everybody has their own opinions on that. And of course, I don't know how you would gauge success in terms of box office money or your own personal feelings of a film. Everybody has their own opinions on that. I would say the top 5 films that I put together are a little bit of both. I enjoyed all of them. At the same time, they were box office successes. They were big successes. And that's another point that I wanted to bring up here, is that I noticed that all of the movies that we selected here were all big budget Hollywood blockbuster type of films. Like,
was Kill Bill Volume 2? I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
sure. I
I
wasn't.
I think it did pretty well. Yeah.
You could consider all of our movies A-list type of movies. Nobody here said, "Oh, I like Leprechaun 2," or
What?
Gremlins
That
2,
was my number 6.
That's true.
Or
That's
Bride of Chucky. Nobody selected these kind of niche movies, right?
Yeah.
I feel so close-minded now.
Just these are the obvious picks.
And that's the point I'm approaching, right? I mean, it's like what defining a sequel and what makes a good sequel is, it's kind of a lot of it predicted by Hollywood forces, right? Like big budget blockbuster movies that are what we think of as sequels. We don't think of them as like what's a good example? Like, I don't know, like pick any small indie movie, like Three Billboards, right? I mean, we're not gonna see like a sequel to Three Billboards made with like 5 million.
Please, God, no.
we don't see stuff like that. What we see is like Thor 2.
Yeah.
Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. These are all like really expensive movies.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how we think of sequels.
$200 million for Guardians 2. Yeah.
So it's off to you. Like, how do you guys define successful sequels?
I feel like, sorry Ben to cut you off.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
That what you said actually really sets up really well for my kind of very succinct feeling about a good sequel is that it just has to do justice to its origin. Whatever it was made from, I feel like it just has to at least meet the quota, if not surpass. You know, we rarely are seeing surpass the verdict, of a sequel or, an addition to some sort of series.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think it just has to do its justice, if it was initially a story about redemption, what are you dealing with redemption now, I think even the other day, an example of how this happens in the worst way is that I saw a preview for the new Pacific Rim. It's like Pacific Rim Uprising, right? Oh, God.
That does not look so good.
So I wasn't a huge fan of Pacific Rim, the original one, in its story. But at least its story was tolerable enough for me to enjoy, like, the action sequences and the graphics and all that great stuff that Pacific Rim brings to you. But just watching this new trailer, it seems like it's completely lost any concept of its original sort of dilemma. Now it's just like rah, smash, smash, big intense music, fire in the background.
It looks like the Guillermo del Toro eccentricity is gone. It's just generic action.
It's just generic action smash up. Like, definitely, we don't need it. I feel like I'd much rather watch Pacific Rim, the first one, 20 times, than see the second one even just once. Because it's not going to do anything equal or better for me than the first one did.
I think, I absolutely agree. Although I do kind of want to review it for Alignment Week so I can see it for free. But the thing about, in terms of like what makes a good sequel, it seems to me it's really all about evolution, because you definitely want something that makes sense. You want something that's building upon, what came before in a logical way, but you want it to go somewhere. You don't want to feel like you're being fed the same thing over and over again. I love the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek. I thought that was a really, fresh, vibrant, colorful, emotional, exciting, take on that franchise. I liked Star Trek Into Darkness, but I didn't like it as much because instead of kind of going into fresh territory, it was just like, we're gonna kind of remake The Wrath of Khan. We're gonna kind of go back to old ground, and so there wasn't this sense of vitality, this sense of going somewhere to a place where there's something at stake, and it feels alive. Whereas you look at something you look at a movie like Star Trek First Contact, which is a sequel to Star Trek Generations, of course. Generations was this, I think to call the movie dumb is a little bit kind. It was intolerable. It was a totally one-dimensional, simplistic movie, and then for First Contact they go let's make a movie where Captain Picard, where his morality is tested, where he, like Captain Ahab, becomes so obsessed with achieving his goal that he begins to lose his humanity. And ironically, it's, a 21st century human being, an Alfred Woodard, who has to, bring him back, someone from a century that's supposedly less evolved than his, but she's the one who talks good sense to him, and as a result he's able to redeem himself. And it's like, well, okay, that wasn't something we'd seen before. That was really different from Generations. That was different from what we'd seen on The Next Generation as a show. And I think all the sequels we've talked about, well, they all go somewhere. They're all pretty different from what came before. You talked about this, I think, with Terminator 2, Patrick. Like the idea, it's like, we did kind of a pulpy movie, like where the killer robot is chasing this woman. Now we're going to make it a big, epic, larger than life action story with a whole team and with moral ambiguity, with a Terminator you're not sure if you can trust. It's like you've always got to be looking to the future, because otherwise, people are just going to be bored. That's why people didn't like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 as much as Volume 1. Volume 2 didn't feel like it was shaking things up enough. It's like, just dish up some more Groot jokes, to sell some more Groot toys. It's you want to be pushing the envelope, and I think that's what a good sequel does.
So I've got a little bit of a corollary to this question of what makes a good sequel, and this might be a good segue into a question of what makes a sequel. But so I think I've made the point of all of our selections that they were all major Hollywood blockbusters that took a lot of money to make.
Right. Yes.
So my question here is, I'm going to try to frame this properly. Is do sequels, if we're framing them as like Hollywood money-making machines, do they naturally undermine their own credibility as an art? Do they undermine their own artistic credibility? And in that sense, do they have to? Is it naturally an uphill battle for a sequel to be a good sequel? Because as I was saying to Ben before, how there's so many bad sequels out there. It's so obvious that the only reason why this was made was because the first one was successful, and they wanna try to make lightning strike twice. Mm-hmm. But it's not always the case. There are some really good ones, as opposed to the 15 films we brought in here. There are exceptions to that. So, to put it another way, are sequels already guilty and have to prove themselves innocent?
Yes, I think so. I think so.
100% think that is the case. I think kind of like we heard earlier when you said they were remaking Memento. Yeah. And the groan
Talk
that
about
came
guilty.
out of three of us, I don't even know who's gonna direct it. I don't know who's in it. I haven't heard anything about it other than you said they're going to remake it, and I just was like, ugh, disgusting, And I think that's a pretty common, even when the reason I watched the trailer for Pacific Rim Uprising was not because I was, scouring Internet Movie Database like I usually am for, good upcoming trailers. It was because someone said they're making a Pacific Rim sequel, and I was like, oh, God, let me see that. I can't believe it. I was like, I saw the trailer, I was like, oh, God, it's awful, and I think that's you're 100% right there, and I can't think of an instance, really, other than maybe when I was, 7, and I heard Mulan 2 was coming out, that I was like, yes, a sequel, I think that's the rare instance, that I was ever excited, and now it's just dread, ultimate dread.
Now, my own answer to this is, you guys gave a resounding yes, but I would have to say that the top two films that I selected, what James Cameron did brilliantly well with T.2 and Aliens, I would have to say is a slight exception to this rule, because I think with Aliens and T.2, they're so far removed from the first films that people were not necessarily expecting them to burst on the scene and be what it is.
Laura, we can stop.
I was just gonna potentially.
Gotcha.
So I think there is a possibility, or what I'm saying is that it's very rare, but there's a possibility for a sequel to not be born out of this this thing where sequels are just made for the sake of being sequels. Like there's a possibility to make a sequel that's just really damn good and can stand on its own and can blow everybody's expectation. Because as I've said before, I have two examples that kind of go against that.
Well, I want to speak to that because I think your question and the point you raised now. I think those are both really important to consider. I think one thing that's interesting is when James Cameron announced Terminator 2, I'm sure there were a lot of cynics who said, oh, he's just cashing in,
True.
He's going back to, his most popular film. But I'm sure once everybody saw it, whether they liked the film or disliked it, although I don't think I've ever talked to anyone who disliked Terminator 2. but I mean, I'm sure once they saw it, they said, oh, he actually had a story he cared about that he wanted to tell. He had a reason to make this beyond just, oh, let's do another Terminator.
It's purely artistically inspired. I mean, okay, so I'm talking about Aliens and T.2 films that were released in the 80s a long time ago. Like, they're not really in a lot of our memory anymore. But if we want to fast forward into the present day, that to me, that stands up to Aliens and T2 in that regard, in terms of being artistically inspired, I would compare it to Mad Max Fury Road.
Oh, yeah.
And we're having a little debate whether that was a reboot or a sequel. I think it's a little bit of both. But if we were to think of it as a sequel, then I would have to put Mad Max Fury Road along with my other two examples. In that regard.
Yeah, it was tough. I might have to make a revised list someday because Fury Road. Wow. Yeah. But that's a great example. I mean, it's like you look at Fury Road versus the Road Warrior. Well, Fury Road is really different. Fury Road is really Furiosa's story, and Mad Max is more like kind of the gunslinger they hire to help them out to a certain extent, and it's like, that George Miller wanted to tell that story, that he believed in that he didn't just want to make another Mad Max movie, because it isn't just another Mad Max movie.
Well, clarification, I haven't, I could go on Wikipedia and look this up, but does Fury Road's story extend from the Mel Gibson's Mad Max, or is it completely rebooted?
So here's my understanding, and I have to confess I've only seen The Road Warrior of the original three. I haven't seen the first Mad Max or Beyond Thunderdome. But my understanding is that Fury Road is a sequel, but that continuity or evolving the story is not really a concern that George Miller has, because I think like Max's car was destroyed in The Road Warrior, and he uses that same car in Fury Road, or something like that. But at the same time, I think he shows some brief footage from the first Mad Max in Fury Road. So I think it's the idea is like George Miller. It's not like Star Wars where he's thinking about the chronology and this leads to this. This leads to this. It's more oh, I'm just gonna make a couple movies in this world.
I'll have to do some research. But if it falls in the same timeline, then it is technically a sequel.
Yeah.
And
I think it does basically. Yeah.
So there you go.
Oh my gosh, we're gonna have to do a whole other podcast, aren't we? Or maybe do one about reboots, as you suggested.
Reboots.
Yeah.
The topic of reboots. That's another complicated topic.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
Similar to sequels, but anyways.
Do we have any more things we want to say about sequels or general discussion?
Earlier I was going to interject with a point, but I said I'd save it for the end, and this goes to how do we define sequels? I noticed, and I was telling this to Ben earlier in the break, how we kind of brought different perspectives into how we view sequels. For me, I take a more literal view as a sequel as something that follows up the original, the first one, whereas you included the third films in a series and stuff like that. And
the threequels.
You brought in number 3 of number 7, and I think all of them qualifies as sequels. I could have said Deathly Hallows, and that's a legit sequel, but it's not a sequel in terms of number 2. It's a number 7, right? So what is it that makes a sequel? That's one thing that I grappled with putting this list together. I had to decide for myself how I'm going to define sequels, and I took the more literal sense of the second film that follows up a first film. So I wanted to get you guys' feedback as to how you guys define the sequels.
I mean, I could have made a list like that, and it would have been a very, very different list.
Oh, yeah.
I would like to try that just as an exercise. And I even thought about things oh, should I only one film per franchise, But I got so excited about the 5 I picked, and it had some doubling up that I was oh, now that's in my head, I can't get away from that. But I mean, I feel that there's really necessarily no wrong or right way to define what a sequel is, because you could say that anything that's an installment in a franchise is a sequel of sorts. Even prequels are really sequels of a kind. But I mean, it's a fair point, because you could take a very, you could say that oh well, a true sequel is simply the second installment. Yeah, it's interesting to ponder.
I feel like for me, it's comes from either one of two angles. One being audience driven. I feel like the audience can decide this is a sequel for whatever reason. This, as long as it's maybe from the same creator within the relative same universe. What's really restricting you from calling it a sequel, or a prequel, depending on where it falls, chronologically. And I think, secondly, from another angle, it could be directorial. I'm specifically thinking of, again, I'm just going to go ahead and reference yet another video essay on YouTube by the channel Storytellers. And they do a video essay about one of my favorite directors, Guillermo del Toro, and how he has made statements of an intention to make a 3-part series, so to say, about mourning the loss in Spain from, forgive me for not knowing the specifics, from I think some sort of Spanish wartime experience.
The Spanish Civil War, right?
The Spanish Civil War, I think that is correct. And Guillermo del Toro is really concerned with exploring the trauma of a nation as a whole, and how that would affect more society. And he intends to do so, I guess, in 3 movies, but they're not necessarily within a series. So it's The Devil's Backbone is the first one, Pan's Labyrinth is the second one, and supposedly the third one hasn't been made yet. But as we all are probably aware, The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth aren't advertised as being within a series.
Right.
They're almost entirely, standalone films. There is, according to the Storyteller channel, a character that appears in both. A child from the first movie appears as a soldier in Pan's Labyrinth, supposedly. But past that, they're not, it's not like The Devil's Backbone 2, it's Pan's Labyrinth, And I didn't even know about The Devil's Backbone until I saw the Storyteller's video essay, because it was titled Pan's Labyrinth, something is something is something, and I love Pan's Labyrinth, so I clicked on it. And learned about this, and I found this really interesting, that a director might intend to have several movies be correlating, maybe just for a message, for one reason or another, and they might not be advertised like that. So I feel like it's just kind of, maybe the audience calls it that way, the director calls it that way, or maybe it's quite literally franchised as, Terminator 2 or X2, Harry Potter 2 literally has the number of wherever it falls, but, I think it's just circumstantial. It's like I said from the beginning, if it's in the same universe, why not?
Well,
oh, go ahead.
One thing I think is kind of interesting is when talking about the idea of a Del Toro trilogy, of course, in one of these podcasts we've talked about Terrence Malick, and Knight of Cups and Song to Song were shot back to back, and they don't use the same characters or even in the same universe, but that some of them, they feature some of the same actors and explore the same themes of sort of temptation or corruption in creative industries. And it's kind of interesting, non-franchise sequels or spiritual sequels is a kind of whole other conversation. But what were you going to say, Patrick?
Oh no, I'm distracted with Malik. But I was gonna. My note on Malik is those films to me are like his philosophy existential series, and they're kind of related, right? They're almost like sequels for that generation of films. But anyways,
Totally.
back to this defining sequels. I think that out of the three of us, I think you bring the most radical perspective in defining sequels. You have two selections that really struck out to me. What was the Kill Bill Volume 2 and The Phantom Menace. I think The Phantom Menace is a really striking example in that going from the perspective that I brought here today, it wouldn't make my list as a sequel, but because it's the first film of the original trilogy. But if you take, it's the first film of the prequel trilogy. But if you take the prequel trilogy as a whole, it is a sort of sequel to the original trilogy.
Sure.
So, if I were to aggregate all of our responses, I think the only real common thread that I can think of is what makes a sequel film is a film that has to carry the burden of something that's already existing, an existing franchise, an existing universe, or something like that. But that's a really broad general definition. But within that broad general definition, there are different types of sequels. You have Kill Bill Volume 2, which is the second part of something which to me is like one movie, but it's the second part of a standalone film. And then there's like the what was the Prisoner of Azkaban. It's number 3 of a 7 or 8 part series. And then there's the typical trilogy that Hollywood likes to do, like Empire, X2 or whatever, stuff like that. There's like different styles of trilogy, different styles of sequels, but it's like there's only that one common thread. So I guess that's the answer that I'm going with here. That it has to live up to something that's already existing, and that's all I can really take out of this.
I like that because that's like kind of like defining it like in like almost like kind of like not just in terms of like carrying on with characters or a story, but carrying on a legacy. Mm-hmm. And I think like all of the films we talk about, they uphold a legacy, but they also maybe challenge it a bit, which I think is really, really cool because they all take it in unexpected directions. I know. Oh, sorry.
Oh no. So in terms of what I look for in a sequel, how I define a good sequel, is something that upends my expectations. If you look at all the films that I selected, all of them are bold in some way. They upended expectations.
I feel the same way. Well, that's probably another thing that's probably true of all of our selections, I think.
Yeah.
I know we probably have to wrap up soon, but did you mind if I ask you all a question then?
I guess we can handle it.
Well, if you guess. No, I'm just curious, like, are all of you, is there a, and I can go first if you need a minute to think about it. Is there a sequel that's coming out within the next years that you're really looking forward to? And B, is there a movie that doesn't have a sequel that you think should have a sequel?
Ooh, I definitely need a minute to think about this.
Okay.
I have an answer for that already.
Cool, go ahead.
So for me, the sequel that I'm really looking forward to is Episode 9. Because
Nice.
I think they made some significantly bold decisions in Episode 8 of Star Wars that I almost have no idea what they're going to do in Episode 9, and I like that. I like that they didn't just... I like that they didn't go the pure Abrams route and have 7, 8, 9 echo 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah.
I think that would have been completely and utterly boring.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like that I'm not sure what's going to happen in Episode 9. That they could go in so many different directions. So that's one thing. That's one that I'm looking forward to. And the one that's not going to be made, that should be made, that needs to be made, is what I mentioned earlier, the sequel to Alien Covenant. Because I think Ridley Scott really needs to tie this up. Otherwise, Prometheus and Covenant will not make sense. I think Ridley Scott went into it knowing that he was going to make 3 movies.
Because otherwise he wouldn't have ended Covenant the way he did.
Yeah, I think to not make that 3rd movie would destroy this series.
I agree, yeah. you've got to follow up. Don't let the bed bugs bite. A sequel that I'm looking forward to is the second Wonder Woman movie. I'm so excited. Kind of like with, if we're saying, this Wonder Woman series, presumably it's going to be a trilogy. If it's going to follow the sort of Dark Knight trilogy pattern, you got to have a really world-class villain for the second and someone who can really test the hero. And I think Kristen Wiig can test Gal Gadot suitably. The sequel I want to see that I don't think is going to happen is I want to see a sequel to Blue is the Warmest Color. Because
what?
Yes, yeah, which I adore that movie. And as anyone who's familiar with it will know, the original title is The Story of Adele, Chapters 1 and 2. I want to see 3 and 4 because I think the ending of that movie, I think she finds some closure of the character that Alexandra Palos plays, but it is a really downbeat ending, and I mean, as sentimental as it sounds, I want to know that she's going to be okay,
And this is what I was talking about earlier. How sequels, as we know it, the movies that we've been talking about, 90% of the movies we've been talking about, they're all big Hollywood blockbusters.
Yeah,
you don't see sequels on this level but you want to see a sequel like this.
Absolutely.
And another case in point here is there was a sequel to Forrest Gump that never got made into a movie.
Really? I did not know that.
The author who wrote the first Forrest Gump wrote a follow-up to Forrest Gump.
That's fascinating.
I think part of the reason why it never got made is because Tom Hanks didn't want to do it. He decided not to do it. But they were exploring turning it into a movie. But just movies on this level, there's a certain, in terms of production, it stays within a certain level, which is kind of weird. Why couldn't someone crowdsource enough money to make a sequel to Blue is the Warmest Color, right?
I think that's a fair point, yeah. And I know Richard Linklater made 3 before Sunset movies, but that's the exception to the rule. I mean, that never happens. That's right. Kind of unprecedented, what he did. I know there are some other small-scale examples, but it's just not a tradition. And for the most part, I feel like I don't want to see sequels to most movies. I want them to stand alone, but... Yeah. And definitely I think you could do smaller scale sequels, and I think it's a shame that filmmakers don't get the chance to try. I feel like it should be an option.
One, I do not think that there should be a sequel to Blue is the Warmest Color. No, that would be grounds for dramatic eye rolling and sighing, because I personally think that the ending is perfect. But we don't
fair
need to
point.
argue about it.
It's a really good ending. You
it's
make
just
a fair
sad,
point.
But I don't really think about it as sad. I could see how it'd be sad, but I feel like there's enough of us who have maybe experienced similar sentiments to Adele that we can be like, okay, well, eventually it'll just not even be something she thinks about, probably, she'll just move right along in her life.
Fair point,
And I'm pretty certain that she's okay, so you can rest easy. She's alright. And, secondly, I was not prepared at all for that question, so I'm not really a huge fan of my answers. My first one, I just hurriedly looked up, and one that's already a sequel that's coming out this year that I can somewhat be excited about is The Strangers Pray at Night. It's a sequel.
What is that?
It's a sequel to one of my favorite horror movies. Something that surprises a lot of people is that horror is one of my favorite genres. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
And I don't really usually get scared of horror movies because I kind of taught myself, not really at a young age, but a couple years back, I finally learned that you can really easily talk yourself out of being scared of most horror movies, because it's for instance, that Netflix one that just came out, The Ritual, and it essentially takes place in these woods in I want to say something like Sweden or Switzerland or something like that, and there's this weird, it's a whole thing. Anyways, So I already can talk myself out of being afraid of it because it happens. It's only about this specific instance, like it's specifically related to its location.
Wait,
like,
what is it a sequel to?
No. This is just the ritual. I'm talking about. I'm getting there.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to rush you.
Anyway, so the ritual, it happens in Switzerland or wherever, and you can easily really not be afraid of it if you're not there. Like, if you're not in Switzerland or Sweden or wherever this takes place, it's nowhere near America. There's no reason to be afraid of it, right? Well, The Strangers, the original film, I find really quite terrifying because the premise is essentially that it's this couple that goes to, I think, like, their family's cabin or something following some sort of event. It's just the two of them, and they're going to stay the night for whatever reason. And essentially, this totally random group of people wearing these creepy-ass masks are going to invade their home, but in the creepiest, tense, slow way that you could imagine. Like, it starts out that they kind of get a sense that there's, like, something outside, and then you start to see them kind of, like, 100 yards out from the house. You just see them kind of standing there in a mask. It's clearly just a person, and then they, like, knock on the door, and you see through the eye hole that there's a person wearing a mask, and they want to come in, and they're not going to let them in. Eventually they do get into the house and murder them. And they just leave, and I think in the end even they just leave and they take off their masks and they're just normal people and that's it. And I think it's so good because it is something that can truly make me very scared because it has no plausibility to motive or time, location, and reason. It's completely, independent of any of those rules that I can use to talk myself out of, because it doesn't, even in that instance, even if it did happen in Russia, I would still probably be afraid because it's not about, if the location isn't part of the plot. It's just that these people are going to kill them.
That's interesting.
It's really, I'm a huge fan. I love anything scary, especially now that I can talk myself down from being fairly scared of anything, movie-wise, that I find it really hard to find movies that scare me enough to get that adrenaline, like, oh my gosh, like I'm scared. And this is one of them, and I just know that this sequel is not going to do the original justice, but I'm excited nonetheless because I always felt that The Strangers was fairly, underrated as a horror movie. And then, gosh, I just really can't think of a good one that there is no anticipated sequel that I'd like a sequel of. I know that there has been times when, like, a movie ends and I'm like, oh, but I want to see more, and I don't. I guess a couple of those instances are like the Blue Avatar. I at one point in time thought I wanted a sequel. Thinking about it now, I don't really want a sequel.
Still be, 4 of them?
Yeah. And then
2020, 2021, 2024, 2025.
Ridiculous.
Oh my gosh. And then there's The Golden Compass, which is this like children's sort of like book series that had like one movie.
The one movie really mangled the book. I think.
And
They cut out off the ending. They only adapted like 3/4 of the book.
Well, I think at the time when I saw that
ridiculous.
movie, I was, like 10 or whatever, and I think I did research, and it fully intended to make like a whole series, and that's why they cut it off early, because they were going to make that second movie, but they just didn't get enough funding.
I was so excited for that series to come out of the ground, to take off.
It should have been a brilliant movie,
Well, I think part of the problem for me was it pulled its punches. It didn't quite go as far as the books did. I mean, it does have a significant atheist edge to it. And I guess the execs didn't want to like anger the Christian right or some bullshit like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. That's my reading of it. They wanted it to be a pure children's movie. Yeah. Whatever, which didn't work.
It didn't. Yeah, you take the soul out of it.
And so since those two examples aren't really, I don't feel so satisfied with that being my answer, I kind of feel like I'm just going to pick something that hasn't been adapted yet, that hasn't been made from its book series to a movie, And according to Internet Movie Database, it's been in pre-production for like forever, so I don't know if they're actually making it. But it's the Graceling trilogy, and written by Kristen Cashore. It's a fantasy trilogy about this universe where you can have a grace, and it's something that you're kind of like genetically born with, and you have a specific aptitude for a certain thing, and that thing can be like baking or like fighting, and it's this whole universe, and I just would love to see that made into a movie. Hasn't happened yet, but one day would be so nice.
Should we start wrapping up?
I feel like good, yeah.
All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Laura in a second. But I have two things I want to say. First, a couple months ago, I got a Facebook message from Patrick saying, "Hey Ben, I know you like lists. How about we do a top 5 sequels podcast?" And it was an awesome idea, and this has been so much fun today, and that is a testament to what a good idea it was from the beginning. So thank you so much, Patrick.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, Patrick.
I got a lot out of this, actually, a lot more than I thought I would. So thanks to both of you for participating.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
And that brings up the next person I want to thank. There's only 3 of us here, so I'm sure you can all guess who I'm going to thank. But Laura is the first ever T.H.O. movie reviews intern, and this it's a big task. Hosting one of these took me years to figure out how to do it properly, and I'm still learning and making mistakes to this day. And you did a wonderful job today, and thank you so much for guiding us through this hallway of mirrors that's of sequels.
Thank you. I tried my best, I have to say. Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up. If you liked this podcast, please click thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at T.H.O. Movie Reviews. And please check out all the great reviews and content we have at thomoviereviews.wordpress.com. Once again, I'm your host, Lora Herman. I know how to say my own name, I promise. And I'm here with Patrick Belin and Bennett Campbell Ferguson. And from all of us here at T.H.O. Movie Reviews, happy movie watching.